The needle goes in before you're fully awake, not deeply, just a slip. The kind that happens when your fingers are stiff from cold and your eyes haven't adjusted to the light and your body hasn't caught up to the hour yet. A tiny puncture, no bigger than a pinhead, on the pad of your left index finger. You don't even feel it at first. Then the blood wells up, dark and small and terrible, and you yank your hand back so fast you nearly knock over the candle stub beside you, the white silk. You stare at the fabric spread across your lap, heart hammering somewhere in your throat, and scan every inch of it with the kind of attention most people reserve for letters they're afraid to read. Nothing. No mark. The blood stayed on your finger, not on the silk. A quarter inch to the left and you'd be spending the next month working without wages to pay for cloth you destroyed at 4 a.m. because you couldn't be bothered to warm your hands first. You breathe. You press your finger against your apron and hold it there, hard, and breathe again. It's February in London in the year 1840, and you are 17 years old, and the thing you just almost ruined cost more than your entire family will earn in the next 2 years. The thing you just almost ruined is meant to be part of Miss Hartley's wedding trousseau. And Miss Hartley's father is the kind of man who does not simply complain. He is the kind of man who makes Madame Bouchard not in front of anyone, never in front of a client, but you can hear it sometimes through the thin plaster wall between the workroom and the small office where she keeps the account books, sitting alone with the door closed. The sounds muffled, but unmistakable. So you breathe, you check your finger, you hold it away from the silk until you're certain. Then you pick up the needle and keep going. Because what else are you going to do? Welcome back to Henry's History for Sleep. Let's begin. Picture a room so cold you can see your breath. Now make it smaller than you'd like. Lower the ceiling until a tall person has to hunch. Fill it with 8 women and girls bent over their work in the light of candles that are going to run out in an hour, and nobody's allowed to light new ones until Madame says so. Add the smell of hot wax and sizing starch, and the particular sour smell of bodies that have been working since before dawn in a space with one small window that hasn't been opened since November. Layer in the faint sweetness of beeswax polish on the floorboards, and underneath that something damp and old that might be the building itself just slowly giving up. And now add the sound. Not conversation, not music. Just the continuous whisper of needles going through fabric, thread being pulled, the occasional snip of scissors, the tiny crack of someone's knuckles, the sound of 8 people working as quietly as possible, because Madame doesn't like noise and Madame is in the next room. That's the back workroom of Maison Bouchard, a dressmaking establishment of the first quality at 14 Clifton Street, Mayfair, London. And that's where you live and work and will spend approximately the next 3 years of your life learning a trade that is older than any city you'll ever visit, in a city that is simultaneously the most glamorous and the most brutal place in the world. Honestly, I make these history stories and I genuinely have no idea if anyone actually sleeps to them, or if you're all just people who like hearing about women ruining their eyes in the dark over silk that cost more than they'll ever touch in wages. Either way, get comfortable. Here we go. The thing nobody tells you about the history of the white wedding dress is that it almost didn't happen. Not the dress, not the idea, not the whole vast industry that grew up around it, all the lace and tulle and orange blossom and the tradition that a bride must wear white to signal her purity and her innocence and her readiness to become a wife. None of that was inevitable. None of it was ancient. None of it descended from some deep well of human custom that stretched back through the centuries. It came from one woman, one dress. One morning in February 1840, when a 20-year-old queen walked into a chapel at St. James's Palace and stood in front of 12 yards of white Spitalfields silk and changed what every bride in the English-speaking world would wear forever. And you're going to be there. Not in the chapel. You're never going to be in that chapel. But you're going to feel the shockwave of it pass through your workroom like a fist through water. You're going to feel it in the sudden new weight of your work, in the frantic change of orders, in Madame Bouchard's voice going from its usual cool precision to something that sounds worryingly like panic. You're going to be there for the moment an entire visual tradition gets invented. But first, the needle, the cold, the candle that's going to run out in about 45 minutes, and the silk that is still perfect and unbloodied in your lap. Start there. The room is about 12 feet wide and maybe 20 feet deep. This is not a generous estimate, it is the actual truth of the space. The ceiling is low enough that the eldest seamstress, a woman called Mrs. Fenwick, who's been doing this for 32 years and who has a neck that curves forward permanently from decades of bending over work, can touch the beams if she raises her hand above her head. The floor is bare boards, scrubbed weekly with lye, worn smooth in the paths between the work tables so that the grain of the wood shows white and ghostly under your feet. The one window looks out onto a narrow passage between this building and the next, and on a clear afternoon in summer, it might admit 2 hours of direct light. The rest of the time you work by candle, or you work in the grey secondary light that comes through that window, like the light is apologising for not being more. There are 8 of you in here tonight. Well, this morning. The distinction starts to blur when you rise at 3. You are the youngest at 17 and the most recently arrived. You've been here 11 months, which means you're no longer the girl who gets given the absolute worst tasks, though you still get the second worst tasks, which is fine. Progress is progress. On your left is Cecily, who is 19 and from Suffolk, and who can embroider a rosette so fine that customers sometimes mistake it for real lace. She doesn't talk much. She has the ability to go 4 or 5 hours without saying a single word, just bending over her work, and you've started to find this peaceful, rather than strange the way you found it strange when you first arrived. Past Cecily is Hannah, who is 23 and has been here 4 years, and who is therefore the person all the rest of you defer to when Madame isn't in the room. Hannah has a way of knowing things before anyone tells her. She knew 2 months ago that there would be a royal wedding this February, weeks before it appeared in any newspaper, because, she said, she had heard the silk merchants talking in the street outside. You're not sure you entirely believe this, but Hannah was right, and you file that away. The other girls you know less well. Agnes, who is 16 and very quick with a needle, and very slow with everything else. Edith and Jane, who are sisters and who arrived from Bath together last spring. Mary, who doesn't speak unless spoken to, and who some of the others say keeps a Methodist prayer book under her pillow, and Mrs. Fenwick herself, who doesn't count as a girl and who sits at the head of the room like a figurehead on a ship, bent forward, steady, her fingers never stopping. This is your world. This 12-foot wide room, and the slightly larger cutting room beyond it, and the showroom at the front of the house that you're allowed into only when accompanying Madame or carrying finished work, and the attic above where you sleep in a narrow bed beside Agnes, and the kitchen below where you eat your meals standing up because there aren't enough chairs, and Madame uses the kitchen table for pressing. You came here from Hull. You came here because your mother's sister knew a woman whose husband knew someone who once delivered fabric to Maison Bouchard's supplier, and this chain of connections eventually produced a letter from your aunt to Madame Bouchard, and a letter back that said, if you presented yourself in person before the 1st of March with references from your parish church, and evidence that you could already manage a basic running stitch, there might be a position. You presented yourself on the 21st of February. Your hands were shaking. Madame Bouchard looked at you for about 4 seconds and then asked you to sit down and thread a needle. You threaded it. She watched your hands. She asked you to join 2 pieces of calico with a seam. You joined them. She looked at the seam for a long time with the slightly distant expression of someone grading an examination. The tension is inconsistent, she said. Yes, Mum. The join is clean. Thank you, Mum. She was quiet for another moment. You'll sleep in the attic. 2 shillings and 6pence a week, deducted from which is the cost of your room and your 2 meals a day, which I calculate at 1 shilling and 9pence, leaving you 9pence. In the first year I will not give you work above your station. If your work improves sufficiently, you will be trusted with better material. If you damage material through carelessness, I will deduct the cost from your wages. Is that understood? Yes, ma'am. Good. Mrs. Fenwick will show you the workroom. That was 11 months ago. 9pence a week is not nothing. It's not very much either, but you live inside your work, eat inside it, sleep inside it. The coin you take away is almost pure coin. There's nothing to spend it on except occasional luxuries. A cup of tea from the woman who comes by with a tray on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. A sheet of writing paper to send a letter home. You're not saving exactly. You're learning. The savings come later. If the learning goes well, if your fingers stay quick and your eyes stay sharp and you don't make the kind of mistake that makes a client's father make Madame cry through a plaster wall. Right now it's 4 in the morning. The candle beside you is down to a stub, burning in a shallow pool of its own wax. You're working on a piece of bobbin lace trim, not making the lace. You're not skilled enough for that. Mrs. Fenwick makes the lace. But attaching it to the edge of a chemise that will be part of Miss Hartley's trousseau. The chemise is very fine white lawn cotton. The lace is the kind of lace that gets passed down through families like Silver. The attachment must be invisible. The stitches must be so small and so consistent that when someone looks at this chemise 50 years from now, they will not see thread. They will see only fabric and lace meeting as if they grew together. Your finger stopped bleeding 10 minutes ago. The stitch you're making now is approximately 1/16 of an inch. You can feel rather than see it. At 4 in the morning by candlelight, after 2 hours of this kind of work, you're operating partly on touch. Your neck aches. That constant low ache between your shoulder blades that you've stopped noticing. Except when you straighten up suddenly, and it blooms into something more immediate and more specific. Your eyes feel dry. The light from the candle seems to throb slightly when you stare at it too long. So you've learned to look slightly to the side of your work rather than directly at it. This is a trick Mrs. Fenwick taught you. You see better at night from the corner of your eye, she said. Never stare at what you're trying to see. You weren't sure if this was advice about sewing or advice about life. Possibly both. This chemise you're working on is the 7th piece in Miss Hartley's trousseau. There are 14 pieces in total. You have been working on this trousseau, all 8 of you in various capacities, for 6 weeks. It will be finished in 4 days, at which point a man will come with a large leather trunk and take it all away, and you will move on to the next commission. Miss Hartley is marrying in April. Her dress is not part of this order. Her dress is being made by a dressmaker in Paris. This is the kind of information that filters through to the workroom eventually, not because anyone tells you directly, but because you listen. You listen to Madame speaking in the cutting room. You listen to the girls who go out on errands. You listen to Mrs. Fenwick, who knows everything and says very little but occasionally, in her quiet way, lets something slip. The Paris dress is pale blue, very fashionable, very expensive. Madame has strong opinions about Paris dresses, which she expresses only to Mrs. Fenwick, in a tone that sounds balanced, but contains a quality of deep professional conviction that the French, whatever their other merits, do not understand English bodies. You think about Miss Hartley's dress sometimes, while you're doing these tiny invisible stitches. You've never seen Miss Hartley. You've seen her measurements, which tell you she is tall and narrow-shouldered, and has a waist that seems, on paper, almost implausibly small. You've heard her voice once, coming from the showroom while you were passing in the corridor with a bundle of fabric, a voice like a bell struck slightly too hard, clear and penetrating and not especially warm. You wonder what she looks like in pale blue. A lot of brides are wearing pale blue right now. It's 1840, and pale blue is fashionable for weddings, has been for about 3 seasons. Before that, it was pale lavender. Before that, before your time apparently, it was whatever colour you happen to have. That's actually the true history of the wedding dress, and it's not what most people think. Here is what most people think, that brides have always worn white, that white is an ancient tradition, reaching back through centuries of Christian ceremony and classical imagery. All those paintings of goddesses draped in white, all those church carvings. That white means purity. That white has always meant purity, and that's why brides wear it, because they are pure, or at least they are supposed to be, and the dress is an announcement of that fact to everyone assembled. Here is the truth. It's not. It wasn't. It hasn't been for most of recorded history, and the story of how white became the colour of brides is the story of one specific dress, worn by one specific woman on one specific morning, and the fact that she happened to be the most powerful woman in the world. But you don't know that yet. Not today. Not this morning at 4 o'clock in your cold workroom with your burning eyes and your aching neck and your 1/16 of an inch stitches. Right now you only know the pale blue dress in Paris, the 14 pieces of the trousseau laid out across the room in various stages of completion, and the stub of candle that is going to go out in 20 minutes. It goes out in 19. The darkness is not complete. There's a grey beginning of dawn starting to suggest itself at the window, but it's dark enough that you can't safely continue the lace attachment. You set the chemise down carefully, fold it over its tissue paper, and press your hands flat against your thighs to warm them. Beside you, Cecily has put her work down too. She's a dark shape in the grey light, straightening her back with a slow, controlled movement, like someone who knows exactly how much that's going to hurt and has decided to do it anyway. Hannah, at the far end of the table, speaks first. "Light the new ones," she says. It's not a question. Mrs. Fenwick is quiet for a moment from her place at the head of the table. Then, "Light them." Agnes gets up to do it, as the most junior, her footsteps on the wooden floor, the scratch of the flint, the smell of new-lit wax blooming into the cold air. And then light again, steadier than before, filling the room in pools that overlap and mix. "How are the cuffs coming?" Hannah asks no one in particular. 2 hours more, Edith says. "The petticoat's done," says her sister Jane. "The nightgown needs the neck finishing," Mrs. Fenwick says and looks at you. "I know," you say. "After the lace." She nods. She picks up her own work again. She's the one making the lace. Bobbin lace so fine it looks like frost. And the room settles back into its quiet. 8 people working in the improved candlelight, the grey at the window slowly warming to the colour of old paper, and somewhere beyond the walls of the building the city beginning its morning. The first carts on the street, the early hawkers, a dog. This is every morning, or almost every morning. The rhythm of it has become yours now, has seeped into your body the way cold seeps into a room. You wake at 3 or half past, pull on your clothing in the dark. You've got so you can dress without a candle, hands finding buttons and hooks by feel. And you're at your bench by 4, and you work until 8, when Madame allows the breakfast break. 15 minutes, bread and a cup of tea, standing in the kitchen with the others, and then back to work until 1 o'clock, which is dinner, and then back to work until 7 or 8, or whenever Madame decides the day is done, which varies depending on how much there is to do and what kind of mood she's in. On days when there's a lot to do, 7 o'clock is optimistic. On the Hartley Commission days, you've been going until 9, sometimes half past. Getting up from the workbench and feeling your body remember all at once everything it's been ignoring for the past 17 hours. The ache in your lower back, the ache in your neck, the particular burning tiredness behind your eyes, the way your fingers feel at the end of a day of fine work. Not exactly sore, more like used up. Spent. Like they've been doing something and now they need to rest. You climb the stairs to the attic and you're asleep before you finish the thought you started at the bottom of the first step. And then 3 o'clock, and you start again. This is the life of a dressmaker's apprentice in the best establishment in Mayfair in 1840. And when I say best, I need you to understand what that means. Maison Bouchard is not the most fashionable address in London. The most fashionable address in London for dressmaking is something called a court dressmaker, or more properly a mantua maker, and there are exactly 7 establishments in London that deserve that title, and Maison Bouchard is not one of them. What Maison Bouchard is very good at a very specific thing. The making of high-quality trousseau items and day dresses for the wives and daughters of the professional and merchant classes who have money enough for good quality, but not quite money or connections enough for a court dressmaker. Which means, in practice, that Madame Bouchard's clients are precisely the sort of women who want you to believe they could afford better if they chose to. The sort of women who talk about their Paris dresses at some length. The sort of women who, when a queen does something, within 48 hours are absolutely certain they were going to do exactly that thing anyway. But again, you don't know about that yet. What you know on this particular February morning is that there is a hole forming in the heel of your left stocking, and you don't have a free moment to darn it, and that your neck hurts, and that the Hartley trousseau has 4 days left to run, and after that there's a brief gap before the next commission, and Madame has hinted, without quite committing to the word, that the girls might have a half day off. A half day. You've been in London for 11 months and you've had 3 half days. On the first one you went with Agnes to look at the shops on Oxford Street and stood at the windows for an hour, looking at displays you couldn't afford, and then it started to rain and you went back. On the second one you got the letter from your mother telling you that your youngest brother James had grown 2 inches since you left, and you spent the rest of the half day sitting on your bed in the attic, reading the letter 3 more times. On the third one you went to St. George's Church on Hanover Square because you hadn't been to church in 6 weeks, and you felt the absence of it pressing on you in ways you couldn't quite articulate. And you sat in a pew near the back and listened to the service and felt briefly less like a piece of a very large machine and more like a person. That was in October, 4 months ago. You'd like another half day. First, though, the nightgown's neck finishing, the cuffs, the last piece of lace trim on the sleeve of the best day dress, the pressing, which is done last, always done last, because pressing with a heavy iron on delicate fabric is the kind of task where a moment's inattention leaves a mark that cannot be undone, and so it happens after everything else is finished, when everyone is fresh, or at least relatively fresh, relatively meaning they've had a night's sleep and a cup of tea. The pressing is always Madame's work or Mrs. Fenwick's, not yours, not yet. Not. Your iron work is competent, but competent isn't good enough for client-facing pieces. You pick up the chemise again, the lace edge, the needle. You find your place in the work with your fingers and begin again. The thread is white silk, so fine you can barely see it. When you hold it up to the light, it's almost invisible, a thin filament that catches the candlelight only when you angle it just right. This is the point, the whole point. Visible thread is bad thread in trousseau work. The stitching should be invisible. The join between lace and fabric should look inevitable, as if it happened naturally, as if no one sat in a cold room at 4 a.m. with burning eyes making it happen stitch by stitch. Your mother thinks you work in a shop. Not exactly wrong. There is a shop. The showroom at the front with its bolts of fabric and its fashion plates pinned to a board, and its chairs for clients, and the little table where Madame keeps a box of sugared almonds that she offers to clients who are spending a particularly large amount of money. Your mother imagines you standing in this room, handing things to ladies. She imagined something lighter than it is, more standing, less hunching, more light, less candle. You haven't corrected her exactly. You've described the work honestly when she's asked. But there's a gap between a description and the actual physical reality of sitting in a cold room at 4 a.m, doing tiny invisible stitches by candlelight for the 9th consecutive week, and you've never quite found the words to bridge that gap in a letter. It's not unhappy exactly. It's not the word you'd reach for. It's absorbing sometimes. The work itself has a quality to it that you've come to value. The way a stitch either is right or isn't. The way good work feels different in your hands than bad work. A certain precision and inevitability that satisfies something in you. And you are learning. Every week you can do something you couldn't do the week before. Not dramatically. The learning is incremental, fine-grained, a matter of tiny improvements in consistency and control, but it's there. You can see it when you look at work you did in March and compare it to work you're doing now. The earlier work isn't bad, but it's looser, less certain, less yours. Mrs. Fenwick said something to you once that you've thought about since. A stitch, she said, not looking up from her bobbins, is a decision. Every stitch you make, you decide. The size, the tension, the angle, the distance from the last one. Most people who haven't done this don't understand that. They think it's mechanical. It isn't. It's thousands of decisions, made quickly but still decisions. She paused. In time the decisions become instinct, but they're still decisions. You think about this when you're working. The fact that each tiny stitch is a choice. That this seam, this invisible join between the lace and the white lawn cotton, is made up of probably 800 individual decisions you're making at a speed that doesn't leave room for conscious thought. You wonder if that's what it feels like to be very good at something. Like the decisions happen before you know you've made them. It's 6 o'clock now. The window is showing actual light. Not dawn exactly, not yet, but the particular pale blue-grey that London mornings have in February. The sky, the colour of old pewter. The buildings across the narrow passage resolving themselves from black shapes into actual walls. You can hear the city more clearly now. The traffic on the main street 1 block over. Voices. The sound of something being unloaded from a cart. Crates or barrels being moved. The rattle and thud of it. A horse. 2 horses by the sound. And the particular sound of iron-rimmed wheels on wet stone, which means it rained overnight though you didn't hear it. London is made of sounds you've slowly learned to distinguish. When you first arrived, they were just noise, vast, undifferentiated, the sound of a city that never quite stops. Now you hear them separately. The delivery carts and the passenger carriages and the chair carriers, the news sellers and the milk sellers and the woman who comes up Clifton Street every Tuesday morning selling watercress, fine watercress, sweet watercress, her voice carrying up and over the building's walls, the church bells. There are so many churches in Mayfair, so many bells, and you've learned which ones sound at what hour and which ones have a slightly flat note, and which of them you can use to orient yourself if you get turned around in the unfamiliar streets. You grew up with 1 church, 1 bell. You still miss the specific sound of it sometimes, in a way you can't quite explain to yourself, the way a particular sound can hold an entire life in it. But London is a different kind of sound, and you're slowly learning it. Breakfast, Madame Bouchard says. The word appears at the workroom door without warning. That's her way. She doesn't knock. She appears. She says what she has to say. She goes away again. You've never heard her say, "Good morning," though you've been here 11 months. You've also never heard her be cruel. She exists in a category that doesn't quite map onto warmth or coldness. She's thorough, precise, demanding, occasionally satisfied, never effusive. She's a small woman, maybe 50, with grey hair, dressed simply, and a face that might have been pretty once and is now something better than pretty, carved by knowledge and time into something that holds its shape. She makes money running this place. That much is clear, though you don't know how much. She has a house in Islington she travels to on Sundays, a husband who repairs watches, 2 children grown and gone. She has opinions about silk merchants and French fashion, and the state of the lace trade, and the inconsistent quality of certain threads that had been deteriorating for 3 years since the supplier changed his source. She shares these opinions with Mrs. Fenwick occasionally and with no one else. You put down your work, wrap it in tissue and go downstairs. Breakfast is bread. Yesterday's bread, which at this hour means it's been made no longer than 18 hours ago, which is fine. And tea, that is real tea, and not pretending to be tea, which is something you didn't take for granted until you heard from your mother that the price of tea had gone up again and she was making the leaves do 2 pots. 2 shillings a pound for the cheap kind, which is what most working families in London drink when they drink it at all. You know this because you helped buy tea twice in the past year, sent out by Madame with coin and a very specific list. You stand in the kitchen with the other girls and drink your tea quickly because the cups are needed back, and you eat your bread standing at the counter, and you do not talk much because this is 15 minutes, and 15 minutes is not a conversation. It's just a pause, just a moment of not working, inserted into the long arc of the day. Agnes is standing beside you, eating bread with the focused efficiency of someone for whom food is primarily fuel. She's small and pale and quick, Agnes, with the slightly haunted look of a girl who was hungry often enough before this, that being fed regularly is something she doesn't take for granted and hasn't yet learned to take for granted. She comes from somewhere in Suffolk. She doesn't talk about it much. Cold last night, she says. Yes. Think it'll freeze again? Don't know. This is the extent of conversation at breakfast. You finish your tea, you put the cup back on the tray, you go upstairs. Now it's 7 o'clock and the full day is beginning. Let me tell you about wedding dresses before 1840. Because to understand what is about to happen, what you're about to watch happen in your own small workroom, you need to understand what came before. Before 1840, there was no tradition of white. None. It did not exist. The idea that a bride should wear white on her wedding day, that white meant something, purity, innocence, the announcement of a new beginning, was not yet a thing that people believed. Not because people didn't care about purity or innocence or the symbolism of colour. They cared enormously. They were, if anything, more obsessed with these things than we are now. But they expressed these concerns through different colours in different ways. In England, in the centuries before 1840, brides wore their best dress. That's it. That's the tradition. You wore the best thing you owned. If you were wealthy and your best dress was gold brocade, you wore gold brocade. If you were a tradesman's daughter and your best dress was green wool, you wore green wool. If you were a queen and your best dress was covered in pearls and embroidered with ermine, you wore that, because that was what you had, and that was what made the occasion special. Colour had meaning, yes. There were rhymes about it. Marry in blue, love forever true, marry in yellow, ashamed of your fellow, marry in red, wish yourself dead. But these were sayings, superstitions, suggestions, not rules, and they varied by region and by class and by decade. White was complicated. White was expensive, genuinely, practically expensive, in a way that has nothing to do with fabric cost and everything to do with maintenance. White gets dirty. White shows every mark. If you owned a white dress in 1840 and wore it more than once, you spent more money keeping it white than you did on almost any other garment you owned. You needed specialist laundresses, special treatments, careful storage. White was a statement of wealth because white said, I can afford to wear something impractical. I have money enough to keep this clean. For this reason, white was mostly worn by the wealthy, but not specifically for weddings. It was a party colour, a ball colour, a presentation colour. Young women making their debut at court wore white. Debutantes in their first season wore white. It was the colour of entering society, of being presented, of beginning. But beginning a marriage specifically. That was not the particular association. White also had other associations. White was worn at christenings, yes. White was worn for mourning in some parts of the world, in China, in parts of the Catholic tradition, in places where death was not darkness but departure, a going into the light. White was the colour of the shroud. White was ambiguous. In England, in the 18th century, if a queen was getting married, she might wear a silver gown. She might wear cloth of gold. She might wear something embroidered so heavily it stood by itself. White would have seemed peculiar, too simple, too plain for the occasion. And then, in 1840, Victoria decided she was going to wear white. Why? This is the question everyone asks, and the answer is not as dramatic as the legend suggests. Victoria was a young woman, 20 years old, thoughtful, strong-willed, deeply interested in fashion and appearance. and she had been thinking about her wedding dress for months. She wanted something that showed off the English lace industry, which she cared about genuinely and also politically. Honiton lace, made in Devon, had been struggling. Machine-made lace from the continent was undercutting the handmade English product. If the Queen wore English lace on her wedding day, in front of all the guests and all the reporters and all the portrait painters, it would be a statement about English craftsmanship that no pamphlet or proclamation could match. For the lace to show properly, you needed a plain background. You needed the lace to be the thing people looked at, not the fabric beneath it. The best background for lace is white, because white doesn't compete. White lets the lace speak. So, white. Not primarily because of purity or innocence or any of the meanings that were subsequently attached to it. White because you want the Honiton lace to show, and white makes the lace show. That's the real reason wedding dresses are white. But the meaning that attached itself to the choice afterward, the story that grew up around it, that white was ancient, that white meant something it had never previously meant, that's the other story. The story of how a fashion choice becomes a tradition, becomes a fact, becomes a memory so old nobody can remember a time before it. And you're going to watch that story begin. But not yet. Right now it's 7 a.m, and you're back at your bench and you're working on the neck finishing of a nightgown that belongs to a woman you've never met, who's going to marry a man you've never met, who has a father who makes Madame Bouchard cry through a plaster wall. The neck of the nightgown is edged with a very fine tuck. The tuck is 1/8 of an inch. It runs in a line around the entire neckline, and at intervals it is joined to a thin strip of embroidered cotton. Not embroidery you did, Mrs. Fenwick did that. Tiny, perfect flowers that march around the collar in a row of 6 repeating motifs. And the join must be as close to invisible as you can make it. You work. The light from the window is proper light now, grey but adequate. You've put out the last of the fresh candles because there's enough light from outside, and the room smells a little better than it did at 4 o'clock. More fabric, less hot wax. And the sound of the city outside is full and real now, mid-morning London coming into its stride. Sometime around 9, Madame opens the workroom door and says, "Mrs. Fenwick," the Hartley sleeves. Mrs. Fenwick picks up the piece she's been waiting on and stands. "Needs the lace setting," she says, not really to anyone. "This afternoon," Madame says. "This morning I need you in the cutting room. The Murrington muslin is here." A small ripple runs through the room. The Murrington Commission. A new job. Murrington means, you know this from listening, from piecing together fragments. It means Lady Murrington, who is one of Maison Bouchard's grandest clients, a woman who orders 2 new day dresses a season, and who has a daughter who will need clothes soon, and whose custom is the kind of custom Madame values above almost everything else. Because Lady Murrington knows people, and the people Lady Murrington knows also need dresses. Fashion in 1840 is an industry of connections, not advertising. There are no advertisements for dressmakers, not really, not for establishments of quality. You get clients by having clients who tell other clients. You get Lady Murrington by having done excellent work for someone Lady Murrington respects. And Lady Murrington telling her friends about you is worth more than any number of notices in any newspaper. This is the invisible structure beneath the surface of what you do. The fabric and the stitching are the visible part. Underneath is a network of women's recommendations, women's conversations over tea, women's opinions about fit and quality, and whether the silk you used for Mrs. So-and-so's bodice was really as good as it appeared, or whether it'll start to wear after 6 months. That network is everything. Madame knows this more thoroughly than she knows anything else. Mrs. Fenwick goes to the cutting room. The room is quieter with her gone, not noisier, but quieter, paradoxically. The way a room feels empty when a certain person leaves it, even if other people remain. You work on the neck tuck and on. The morning passes the way mornings pass in the workroom, in the small increments of completion. One finished seam, one section of embroidery join done, one tuck pressed and set by Edith, who's allowed to press certain items when Mrs. Fenwick is busy. Agnes, working beside you, is doing the hem of a petticoat with a gathering stitch that she's very good at, better than you. The gathering fine and even, the ruffle crisp. She works quickly. Her needle moves at a pace that still slightly astonishes you, not rushing, just efficient, with the quality of someone for whom the movement of a needle through fabric has become completely automatic. "You'll be getting those stitches down," Mrs. Fenwick said to you once, when you first arrived and were watching Agnes work with what must have been an obvious expression of something like awe. "When?" you asked. She looked at you. "Longer than you think, shorter than it seems possible." This was, you have come to understand, very specific wisdom. At 10:30, the sound of the bell at the front door, a small brass bell that sounds when anyone opens the showroom, brings a slight stiffening to the room. Not alarm, just attention. The girls pause their work momentarily, listen. Voices from the front. Madame's voice, and a woman's voice you don't recognize, and the faint sound of someone moving through the showroom. A client, or a prospective client. Either way, not your concern. But Hannah is listening with her head slightly tilted, the way she does, and she says quietly, "Miss Hartley." You look at her. "Sound of her shoes," Hannah says. "Heels, high ones. She walks like she's trying to make more noise than she is." You've never once thought to learn clients by their footstep. You file this away too. The visit from Miss Hartley lasts 45 minutes, which you measure by the church bells from St. George's, which ring the quarter hours. You can't hear what's said. You can hear occasional fragments of tone through the floor. Madame's voice, smooth and even. Miss Hartley's voice, which is neither. And the sound of what might be fabric being moved, examined, returned. The trousseau pieces that are finished are kept in the showroom during business hours, displayed on a special stand Madame has for this purpose, for clients to inspect. When Miss Hartley's visit is over, you hear her leave, the high heels, the bell, the quiet afterwards, and then Madame appears in the workroom door. Her face is what you'd call controlled. "The collar on the day dress needs to be taken down a 1/4 inch," she says. "Miss Hartley feels it's too high." A pause. Long enough that Hannah looks up briefly and then looks down again. "The collar on the day dress," Mrs. Fenwick says, "was made to Miss Hartley's own specification, which she confirmed in writing in November." "I know," Madame says. Another pause. "A 1/4 inch," Mrs. Fenwick says. "A 1/4 inch. The embroidery on the collar is set." "I know." The two women look at each other. The room is very still. "When she comes to collect," Madame says, "I will point out the fine craftsmanship and the excellent execution of her specification. I will suggest that perhaps at the next fitting, if the collar seems to trouble her, we might consider a small adjustment." "And if she presses?" Mrs. Fenwick asks. Madame allows herself a very small, very controlled expression that contains, if you know how to read it, and after 11 months you're beginning to, a mixture of exhaustion and something like professional sorrow. Then we adjust the collar, she says. She goes away. Mrs. Fenwick looks at the ceiling for one moment. Then she picks up her bobbins and says, to no one in particular, the collar will not be adjusted. Nobody asks how she knows. She just does. She's been doing this for 32 years. You go back to work, and this is the shape of a morning in the workroom. The needles, the thread, the silence with its layers of meaning. Productive silence, companionable silence, the occasional silence of barely controlled professional frustration, and the light changing incrementally from candle to grey to the pale flat light of a London February morning, and the city outside doing its continuous business while you do yours, each separate and complete and utterly dependent on the other. The city outside is the reason this work exists. The city outside is the reason Miss Hartley can afford a 14-piece trousseau made by professional hands in a Mayfair establishment. The city outside is the reason Maison Bouchard exists, and Madame Bouchard and the 7 other establishments whose work is better, and the 100 other establishments whose work is worse, and the whole elaborate system by which the women of London's prosperous classes express their prosperity through what they wear. Fashion is not vanity. Well, it is partly vanity. Madame would be the first to admit that. It would be absurd to deny it. But it's also information. In 1840, what you wear is what you say about yourself before you open your mouth. Your cloth speaks your income. Your cut speaks your taste. Your colour speaks your social position, your ambitions, your marital status, your age, your mourning if you are in mourning, your celebration if you are celebrating. Everything that would require a lengthy explanation to communicate in words can be communicated immediately, wordlessly, by the right dress worn correctly. This is why Miss Hartley's trousseau costs as much as it does. It's not just nightgowns and petticoats and chemises. It's the first chapter of a story she's telling about who she is now that she's married. The story of the kind of wife she intends to be. The story of the kind of household she intends to run. And the story begins in the quality of the stitching that nobody except the women in this room will ever see. Your stitching is part of that story. The nightgown neck you're finishing right now, no one in society will ever look at it. No portrait painter will capture it. No fashion plate will reproduce it. The man Miss Hartley marries may never notice it. But it needs to be perfect because perfection is not about being seen. Perfection is about being the kind of person who does things perfectly whether or not anyone's looking. This is the first real thing the work has taught you that you didn't know when you came here. At noon, Madame sends you out. This is not unusual. Errands are part of the apprentice's work. Fetching supplies, delivering things, carrying messages. Usually it's Agnes who goes, as the youngest. But Agnes today is in the middle of a gathering sequence that Madame doesn't want interrupted, and so it's you. Mr. Partridge on Long Acre, Madame says, giving you a list and a small leather purse. Thread and the sewing needles I ordered, and if he has the eyelets in, bring those back too. If not, tell him Tuesday at the latest. Mr. Partridge's shop is approximately half a mile from Clifton Street, which in good weather would be a pleasant walk, and in February in London is a wet, cold, grey slog through streets that have been churned by traffic into a kind of thick, muddy paste that gets on your boots and the hem of your dress immediately. You wrap your shawl tight and go out. London in February is not its most beautiful self. The sky is the colour of cold pewter, low and flat, with clouds that look like they might be considering rain, or might already be delivering a very fine rain that hasn't quite decided to commit. The air is cold enough that you can see your breath, and it smells of coal smoke and horse, and the particular whetstone smell of a city that has been rained on recently. Your boots are good boots, good enough, practical, sturdy leather, but the mud on the streets is persistent and gets into the seam around the heel within the first block, and that's just how it's going to be. You like going out. You won't say this to anyone in the workroom because Madame doesn't like to suggest that going out is a privilege. It's a task, and a task should be done with efficiency and returned from with equal efficiency, but you like it. The air, the space, the way the city expands around you the moment you step out of the narrow passage between the buildings and onto the street itself. And suddenly you're in a space where you can see the sky, however grey the sky is, and other people are moving freely around you, and everything is sound and motion instead of quiet and stillness. The streets around Clifton Street are wide and clean by London standards. Mayfair maintains itself, has the money to maintain itself, with smooth paving stones and decent footpaths along the sides, and the occasional scraper by a front door for the mud on boots. The shops here are the better sort. Grocers with their windows full of hams and cheeses and paper cones of tea. Milliners with their displays of bonnets. A bookseller with volumes stacked in the window so dense that the view through the glass is entirely blocked. You walk quickly, because Madame said efficiency, and because it's cold, and because the errand to Longacre and back is going to take at least an hour, and you want to make it less. The city around you is doing its usual things. A coal merchant's cart rumbles past, the horse sweating despite the cold, the coalman hunched on his board with his coat pulled tight. Behind him, walking, a woman in a dark dress with a basket over one arm and her head down against the wind, a boy running. Where? From what? His feet slapping the wet stones as he passes. Two men outside as tobacconists having a conversation of some length about something, gesturing with their hands. A pair of ladies in a carriage, visible through the glass of the carriage window, one of them speaking and the other listening with the patient look of someone who has heard this particular conversation before. London has a quality that Hull didn't have, that no city you've been in before has had. The quality of everything happening simultaneously. Not consecutively, not in order, not in a way that makes narrative sense. Every moment contains dozens of separate complete narratives all happening at once, and you're moving through the middle of all of them without access to any of them. The coalman has a story. The woman with the basket has a story. The running boy has a story. You pass through all their stories without touching them, and they pass through yours without touching you, and the city goes on containing all of you without concerning itself with the details. You've thought about this more than you expected to. You've thought about it when you were at the workbench doing the invisible stitches, thought about all the other rooms and all the other buildings on this street and the next street and the next, all the hands working at all the things they work at, all the quiet, purposeful industry of a city going about its business. The idea that the city is made of these rooms, these small spaces where one specific thing is done with precision and care, the baker baking the bread and the chandler dipping the candles, and Mrs. Fenwick making the lace and Mr. Partridge selling the needles and thread. All of these separate, complete worlds, each producing some necessary piece of the larger whole. It's different from how you thought of London before you came here. Before you came here, London was a single thing, a city, a great place, somewhere vast and grand. Now it's specific. Now it's Clifton Street, and the narrow passage outside the workroom window, and the particular sound of Miss Hartley's high heels on the showroom floor, and the smell of Madame's hair powder when she leans over your work to inspect it. The particular smell of new thread when Mr. Partridge opens his drawer. You get to Long Acre in about 20 minutes, which is good. Long Acre is a wide street north of the Strand. Its shops a mixture of carriage makers and haberdashers, and tool merchants, and the sundry businesses that accumulate wherever skilled tradespeople concentrate. Mr. Partridge's shop is a small frontage squeezed between a carriage wheel maker and a leather goods seller. The window full of spools of thread in a range of colours that seems, every time you see it, slightly miraculous. All that colour, organised by gradation from one end to the other, white to cream to yellow to gold to orange to red, and around through all the colours back to white. Inside, the shop is small and deep, and smells of thread and wax and something faintly metallic that might be the needles, or might be the scissors hung in a rack on one wall, or might simply be the smell of a room where metal objects have been kept for a long time. Mr. Partridge himself is a compact man of about 50, with grey whiskers, and the particular expression of a person who spends their days surrounded by things they understand precisely and like very much. He knows fabric merchants, needle manufacturers, the histories of various thread types, the argument for linen thread versus silk in certain applications, the character of different dressmaking establishments in Mayfair and their particular needs. He looks at Madame's list and begins pulling things from drawers. The number 8 needles she wanted, he says. I've got them. Just came in yesterday, actually. Better quality than the last batch. She was right to complain about those. The eye was wrong on too many of them. These are correct. She'll be glad, you say. She should be. Tell her the price went up a halfpenny per dozen. Not my doing, the manufacturer. I tried. He puts the needles on the counter. The eyelets. He looks up, and there's a particular expression on his face that you've learned to read from suppliers. The expression of a man about to deliver news that isn't quite what you wanted. Tuesday, you say. He nods. Tuesday. Thursday at the absolute latest. The order's in. It's just timing. I'll tell her. You can tell her also that the quality is going to be excellent, because I specified it clearly this time, and the maker understands what I want. Last batch the coating was inconsistent. These will be better. You gather the needles and the thread from the counter, pay from the purse, make a note of the eyelet situation in the way you've been taught, brief, precise, the specific day, the quality note, nothing that can be misremembered, and go back out into the February street. The walk back takes you down a slightly different route, partly to see a bolt of fabric Cecily mentioned in a display window at a linen draper's on Vere Street, which you're curious about, and which you can look at without any obligation to buy, since you are obviously not a woman of means. The linen draper's window is full of fabric, dark wools and pale muslins, and one piece of cream-coloured satin that catches the flat February light in a way that makes it look warmer than the air around it, almost golden, almost alive. You look at it for a minute. Then you walk on. That's the other thing about London that's different from Hull. In Hull, things were for you or not for you in a fairly clear way. Here, everything is for you to look at, whether or not it's for you to have. The wealth of London is on display for everyone. The shop windows, the carriages, the clothes on the people in the street. You can look at all of it. Looking costs nothing. What you make of the looking is the question. You're back at Clifton Street by 1:30. Madame receives the needles and the message about the eyelets with the same face she receives most things. A nod, a slight tightening around the eyes that could be satisfaction, or could be the suppression of a stronger feeling, and send you back to the workroom. Mrs. Fenwick takes the thread from you. Dinner, Hannah says, and you realise you've missed it. Walk through your dinner hour on your errand. I've got bread, Agnes says, and produces from somewhere. Her apron pocket, maybe. A piece of bread she must have kept back from this morning. Slightly flattened but intact, and hands it to you. You eat it standing up. Did you go past the print shops? Hannah asks. You pause. You did walk past the print shops, actually. There's a row of them on Vere Street between the linen drapers and the corner. But you were looking at the fabric and didn't pay much attention to the prints in the windows. I walked past them, you say. What were they showing? You try to remember. Fashion plates, which they always have. Political cartoons, some of which you can't always read fast enough to understand before you've walked past. Something about horses. The usual things, you say. I didn't look closely. Hannah makes a small sound that might be acknowledgement and goes back to her work. You don't ask why she wanted to know. You'll understand eventually. You always do, with Hannah. The afternoon passes in its increments. You finish the neck of the nightgown and move to the hem of a second petticoat, which is plain work. A strong running stitch, turned twice. And you do it quickly because plain work is relief after fine work, your hands moving with more confidence in the simpler task. The hem goes well. You finish it while there's still good light from the window and begin the gathering on a muslin sleeve that Madame has asked for by tomorrow morning. The gathering takes concentration. The thread must be 2 equal lengths, parallel, each one spaced the same distance from the edge. The gathers pulled to exactly the specified measurement and then held while you set them with a third line of stitching. If the gathers aren't even, if one side pulls tighter than the other, if the spacing is inconsistent, it shows immediately in the finished sleeve. There's no hiding uneven gathers. The fabric just tells the truth. You're 3/4 through the first sleeve when Madame opens the workroom door in a way that's slightly different from usual. The door usually opens 2/3 of the way and she stands in the gap. This time it opens all the way, and she stands in the frame of it, which is unusual enough that all of you look up. Her face is doing something you haven't seen before. Not the controlled expression, not the professional calm. Something different. Something that might be, in another face, on another woman in different circumstances, excitement. In Madame's face it's more restrained than that. More like the moment before excitement decides what form to take. There has been news, she says, from the palace. The room is very still. Madame says, the Queen's dress has been described. Another pause. She is wearing white, Madame says. White Spitalfields satin and Honiton lace. White from the veil to the hem. You look at the white silk thread in your lap, the white lawn cotton of the nightgown you've spent the morning on, the white muslin of the sleeve. All white? Mrs. Fenwick asks, in a voice so carefully neutral it contains, you can hear it, the entire weight of someone deciding whether to have a feeling about this information. All white, Madame confirms. The lace alone. They're saying 42 workers, months of work. She wanted English lace. She wanted to show the English lace industry. Smart, Hannah says, almost to herself. Nobody tells her to be quiet. Madame looks at her briefly and nods once. Smart, she agrees. Very smart. Then she looks around the room at all of you, and her expression settles into something that is more recognizable. Something crisper. I expect, she says, that by the end of the week every bride in London will want white. She lets that sit in the air for a moment. We should be prepared, she says. Mrs. Fenwick, tomorrow we will look at the white fabric stocks. I believe we have sufficient silk, but the taffeta needs replenishing, and the cotton lawn was low last time I checked. I'll check in the morning, Mrs. Fenwick says. Madam nods once more, and goes away. The room is quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that isn't actually quiet at all, that is full of things people aren't saying yet. Then Agnes says very quietly, Why white? What does white mean? Nobody answers immediately. Then you say, not because you know, but because you've been thinking about this since Madame spoke. Nothing yet, that's the point. It means whatever she wants it to mean. Everybody goes back to work, but something has shifted. You can feel it in the room, in the air, in the way the girls are sitting. Something has just changed, and you all know it, and none of you quite knows yet how large that change is going to be. You find out the next morning. Actually, you start finding out that same evening when you go out to the kitchen for water and overhear a conversation between Madam and Mrs. Fenwick in the cutting room that isn't quite a conversation you were supposed to hear, but that you hear anyway, standing in the narrow corridor with your cup in your hand. 3 inquiries already, Madame is saying. 3, between this afternoon and supper, all asking about White, Mrs. Thorpe's daughter, Lady Farrell's niece, and Mrs. Pendleton herself, who is not even engaged, she just wanted to know in case. In case, Mrs. Fenwick says, in her most neutral tone, which means she's working very hard not to express a strong view. In case, Madame confirms. And then she says something that you remember because she says it with a particular quality of certainty. The voice of a woman who has spent 30 years watching fashion move. This is going to change everything, not just this season. Everything. You think it'll hold? Mrs. Fenwick asks. A fashion can be one season. This isn't a fashion, Madame says. This is a queen. You take your water and go back to the attic. You lie in your narrow bed in the dark with Agnes's steady sleeping breath beside you, and you think about that. This isn't a fashion. This is a queen. There is a difference. You're beginning to understand the difference, though you couldn't have articulated it when you arrived here 11 months ago. A fashion is what the stylish women are doing this season, which means that in 2 seasons they won't be doing it anymore, and the women who are still doing it will look like they missed a turn. A fashion is lavender for spring weddings. A fashion is a particular sleeve width, a particular bonnet shape, a particular way of trimming a hem. What a queen does is different. What a queen does becomes idea. And ideas last longer than fashions. The white wedding dress, on the morning of February the 10th, 1840, is still just a dress. Tomorrow, or the day after, or next week, it will become something else. It will become the thing that brides do, and 5 years from now, it will be the thing that brides have always done. And 20 years from now, people will explain it as an ancient tradition, a custom with roots in the deep past, because human beings do that. We find something we do, and we tell ourselves a story about why we've always done it, because always is more comfortable than recently. The needle slipped at 4 this morning, and you almost ruined the silk. Tonight, in the dark, you think. You almost ruined white silk before you knew white was going to be everything. Funny how close things come. The morning that follows changes everything in the workroom in ways that are both dramatic and very mundane. The dramatic change. By 9 o'clock, Madame has received 4 messages, 1 delivered in person by a footman, 3 in letters that a boy brought, all asking about white wedding dresses, not trousseau items, not day dresses. wedding dresses specifically, white ones. The mundane change. You're now going to spend the next 6 weeks doing white work to a degree, an intensity that makes the Hartley trousseau look like a simple project. But before all that, there is the Hartley situation. Miss Hartley arrives at 10 that morning, before you've had breakfast in the kitchen, before Mrs. Fenwick has finished laying out the cutting room for the Moorington muslin. The bell rings, and Hannah says, "Miss Hartley," before anyone else has processed the sound. And this time she's right about the footsteps, but she's also right about something else. Something in the quality of the arrival, the pace of it, that tells you this visit is different from yesterday's. You hear the voices begin in the showroom. You keep working, because you're always working. But you listen in the way you've learned to listen, the way everyone in the workroom listens to the sounds from the front, piecing together the conversation from its tone and rhythm, if not its words. The tone tells you immediately, Miss Hartley is not here about the collar. Madam's voice, going up slightly at the end of sentences in a way that means she's asking questions. Miss Hartley's voice, the bell-struck too hard quality of it, rapid. A pause, then both voices together, then Madame alone, slow and careful, the voice she uses when she's being precise about something. This goes on for about 20 minutes, then Mrs. Fenwick is called in. You know this because you hear Madame open the connecting door between the showroom and the corridor and call Mrs. Fenwick's name, and you hear Mrs. Fenwick get up from her place at the head of the room and go out, and the door closes, and the workroom is very quiet. Nobody says anything. You all keep working. Agnes's needle is moving. Edith is pressing a seam. Hannah is cutting thread with the small scissors she keeps looped around her wrist. You can hear the voices more clearly now through the thin wall, but still not the words. 3 voices, Madame, Mrs. Fenwick, Miss Hartley, going back and forth with the quality of a negotiation where one party has changed her position and the other two are trying to establish the parameters of what the change position means practically. Mrs. Fenwick comes back. She sits down. She picks up her bobbins. She says without looking up, Miss Hartley would like her wedding gown to be white. A long pause. She's getting it in Paris, Agnes says cautiously, which is as close to a question as Agnes ever comes. She was getting it in Paris, Mrs. Fenwick says. She has written to cancel the commission. She pauses. She now wants it from Madame. Everyone understands, without it being said explicitly, the size of what this means. A wedding dress from Maison Bouchard, a full court-quality wedding gown, which is not what Maison Bouchard does, not normally, not quite. Trousseau, yes. Day dresses, evening dresses, cloaks, pelisses, but a full wedding gown, the centerpiece of a woman's most important social appearance, the garment that will be described in the society pages and talked about for years afterward. That's different work. That's a different level of everything, Mrs. Fenwick says, still looking at her bobbins. And she wants it white. Nobody speaks for a moment. Then Hannah says, "In how long?" "April," Mrs. Fenwick says. "She's getting married in April," you say, and immediately wish you hadn't spoken because you're not the one who usually speaks in these moments, but the word is out. Mrs. Fenwick looks at you, not unkindly. "Yes," she says. "That's 8 weeks," Hannah says. 8 weeks, Mrs. Fenwick confirms. 8 weeks for a full wedding gown of the quality a Hartley would expect, with the Honiton lace or its equivalent, made in white, properly fitted, a gown that would need at minimum 4 fittings, each one requiring Miss Hartley to come in and try it, each one requiring alterations and then the final pressing and the packing. 8 weeks is not very much time. What kind of white? Edith asks from the pressing table. This is the right question. Mrs. Fenwick looks at her with an expression of acknowledgement. She said white, Mrs. Fenwick says. Madame will advise. Probably silk, perhaps satin. She'll want to match the Queen as closely as she can without looking like she's matching the Queen. This is the other dimension of what's just happened. The dimension that you will come to understand better over the next several weeks as you watch it unfold across London, across the entire fashion world. Not just that everyone wants white, but that everyone wants white in a way that appears to be their own idea. Nobody, no woman of quality wants to say, I'm copying the Queen. They want to have independently arrived at the same elegant conclusion that the Queen arrived at, to have been white before white was the thing, or to be white in a way that's clearly a personal statement rather than a reaction. The result of this, practically, is a sudden enormous demand for a white fabric of all qualities and descriptions, which is a problem, because the better quality white silk and satin, the kind used for important dresses, has not been stocked in vast quantities, because until 3 days ago, nobody particularly needed it. The dressmakers of London are about to discover that the city's fabric supply cannot quickly absorb a sudden mass change in fashion preference. But that's a problem for the coming weeks. Right now, this morning, the problem is simpler. Miss Hartley wants a white wedding dress from Maison Bouchard in 8 weeks, and Madame Bouchard has said yes. And so, everything in the workroom that is not the Hartley dress is, quietly, going to be reorganised around the Hartley dress. Because the Hartley dress is now the most important thing in this building. You learn this gradually over the course of the day in the way you learn most things, by listening, by watching, by piecing together what's being said and what's not being said and what the movement of people in and out of the workroom implies. By noon, Madame has done 3 things. She has sent to the fabric merchants about white silk. She has sent to the lace suppliers about obtaining a quantity of Honiton-style bobbin lace on short notice, which Mrs. Fenwick has already started saying will require extra working hours. And she has apparently gone through the Hartley trousseau specifications and identified that the collar that Miss Hartley wanted, reduced by 1/4 inch, is going to stay exactly as it is, because Miss Hartley is now entirely focused on the wedding dress and has forgotten about the collar. Mrs. Fenwick knew. Of course she knew. You're sent out in the afternoon, this time with a different errand. The fabric merchant on Bond Street, Madame has 2 fabric merchants, and this is the better one, the one she uses for client-facing work, needs to be consulted in person, because the question of what white and how much white requires a conversation, requires looking at actual fabric in actual light, rather than ordering from a list. This time Madame comes with you. This almost never happens. Madame goes to the merchant herself perhaps twice a season for major decisions, and you've never been brought along. You're brought today because Madame says, in the way she says things that are half instruction and half explanation, you need to start learning how to look at fabric in relation to a commission, not just fabric in itself. You walk quickly behind Madame on Bond Street, keeping your shawl tight because the February wind has picked up and found new angles to come from, and you try to keep pace with her, which requires you to walk quickly because Madame has the kind of walk that covers ground without appearing to rush. Bond Street in 1840 is the kind of street that makes you slightly aware of your own clothes. The shops here, the better shops, the ones with the awnings and the polished window glass and the signwriters who use gold leaf, are aimed at people who have money enough not to think about spending it. The women in the street are wearing the fashionable silhouette of the moment, which in 1840 means a tight waist, a wide skirt, sleeves that have come down from the enormous balloon shapes of a few years ago to something more fitted at the shoulder, and bonnets that frame the face closely. The brim angled downward so the wearer looks slightly downcast unless they raise their chin. Everyone's chin is slightly raised as a result. Madame's chin is naturally in this position. She's observing the street as she walks the way she observes a piece of work. The same quality of complete, comprehensive attention. And you understand that she is calculating, reading fabric and cut and quality from a distance, filing information. The fabric merchant is a man called Mr. Aldous, and his shop is wide-windowed and well-lit and smells of fabric. A specific smell, the smell of many different kinds of fabric stored together, wool and silk and cotton all layered, with underneath it the smell of the sizing used to stiffen certain weaves, a sharp, almost chemical quality that you've come to associate with new cloth. Madame says what she needs to Mr. Aldous, who listens with the same quality of thoroughness that she brings to everything, the specific commission, the time frame, the kind of white. White silk, Madame says, Spitalfields if you have it. Good weight, good lustre, not too stiff, it needs to move. Mr. Aldous leads her to the silk section and begins bringing out bolts. You stand slightly behind Madame and watch her work. The way she assesses fabric is not what you'd expect if you'd never seen it. She doesn't just look, she touches. She lifts a corner of the bolt and pulls it slightly away from the board, lets it fall, watches how it falls. She holds it up to the window light, rotates it to see how the sheen changes with angle. She rubs a corner between her thumb and finger, not hard, just feeling. The texture, the weight, the way the threads lie. She does this for 3 different bolts of white silk before she says anything. This one, she says finally to the 3rd bolt. How much have you got? 18 yards on the bolt, Mr. Aldous says. I can get more from the warehouse, might take 3 days. I'll take what's on the bolt now, and the broader piece from the 2nd bolt for the underlining. She prices everything with a speed that tells you she's done this 1,000 times, knows what things cost, knows what they're worth, knows the gap between those 2 things and how much of it she can negotiate. The negotiation takes about 5 minutes and results in a price that Mr. Aldous accepts with the expression of a man who knows he could have held out for a little more, but decided it wasn't worth it. You watch all of this. On the way back, carrying the smaller pieces Madame takes with her, the larger bolts will be delivered. You walk beside her rather than behind, because the pavement is narrow and there's a cart blocking part of the road, and you have to navigate single file through a gap, and then you end up beside her and she doesn't tell you to fall back. What did you notice? She says. Not a question, a prompt. You looked at how it fell, you say, before the texture. She glances at you sideways, not surprised exactly, assessing. Why does that matter? She asks. Because the drape is what the wearer sees in the mirror. How a fabric feels against your fingers is secondary to how it moves against your body. Madame is quiet for a moment. Then she says, most girls don't learn that until their 2nd year. You don't say anything, but you feel something. Not pride exactly, more like the satisfaction of a stitch that turns out exactly right. White is difficult, she says after another few steps. Every imperfection shows, every inconsistency in the weave, every mark. You have to know your fabric more thoroughly with white than with any other colour, because white tells the truth. She doesn't say anything more about it, but you think about it all the way back to Clifton Street and most of the evening while you're working. White tells the truth. The workroom is different in the days that follow. Not quieter or louder. It's always the same volume, there's always the same quality of concentrated silence, but different in its organisation, its purpose. The Hartley trousseau is still being completed, the final 4 pieces requiring the full attention of everyone. The pressing done last Thursday with Mrs. Fenwick at the iron for 3 hours straight. Her face very still in the way it goes when she's doing the thing she's best at. The petticoats, the chemises, the nightgowns, the good day dress with the collar that will not be altered, the 3 better day dresses with their respective trimmings, the morning wrapper, the walking pelisse, all of it done, all of it perfect by the standards you have been taught to apply, which are exacting enough that perfect is used seriously and not loosely. And on the same day the Hartley trousseau is crated and collected by the man with the leather trunk, Madame begins the Hartley wedding dress. She begins it herself. That's the first difference from the trousseau work. The trousseau is distributed among all of you, parcelled out by skill and time, the fine work to Mrs. Fenwick, the good work to Hannah, the competent work to you and Edith and Jane, the straightforward work to Cecily and Agnes. The wedding dress, Madame cuts herself. The first pieces of the pattern, which she's drawn herself on brown paper in the cutting room over the course of a long Tuesday evening, are cut from the Spitalfields silk herself, with the large shears that she keeps separately from the workshop shears, sharpened on a particular stone that lives in a drawer under the cutting table. You hear the shears. Even through the walls you hear them. The long, smooth, decisive sound of very sharp scissors through very good silk. Controlled. Inevitable. You understand that Madame is nervous, though she would never use that word. Maison Bouchard is known for trousseau, and for day dresses. This dress is different. This dress will be seen by people who will know immediately whether it is as good as it should be. If it is not as good as it should be, that information will travel through exactly the same network of women's conversations that brings Maison Bouchard its clients. It will travel with the speed and completeness that all useful social information travels in this city. If it is very good, that will travel too. The bodice boning, Madame says to Mrs. Fenwick on the 3rd day of the dress. I want your opinion. This is how Madame asks for help when she wants to ask for help. She wants your opinion, not your advice, never your advice, because Madame doesn't need advice, but your opinion, which is information she can use while retaining her own authority over the final decision. Mrs. Fenwick gives her opinion about the bodice boning, which is about the placement and stiffness of the whalebone strips that will give the bodice its structure, the corset-like quality that the fashionable silhouette requires, the rigid smoothness from waist to bust that the current mode demands, and that would be impossible without internal structure. You don't hear all of this conversation, but you hear enough through the wall and through the door when it opens to understand. The dress is going to be extraordinary. The boning conversation is a conversation about control. How much, where, in what direction. And Madame and Mrs. Fenwick are working through it with the thoroughness that the material deserves. White silk, white lace, white satin ribbon, white seed pearls on the bodice, which is an addition that came from the second fitting, from something Miss Hartley said while standing in the cutting room in her stays and petticoats, while Madame draped the half-made bodice against her, and Miss Hartley looked in the long mirror and said very quietly, "Something else, here," and touched her own collarbone. Mrs. Fenwick is the one who says pearl seed. Madame is the one who agrees, and the seed pearls are sourced and arrive 2 days later in a small leather pouch that gets kept in the locked drawer in the cutting table and is brought out only when needed. white seed pearls on white silk. The effect when you finally see a finished section of the bodice pinned and basted and nowhere near done is of something that has no colour at all, or all colours at once, the way certain lights look when they're very clear, the way snow looks in morning sun, the way water looks when it's very clean. Just white, but a white that is so present, so itself, so unmistakably there, that it stops being the absence of colour and becomes something positive, something deliberate. You stare at it for slightly longer than you should, standing in the cutting room doorway with a message from Hannah about the lace delivery. Mrs. Fenwick sees you looking. "Well," she says. "It's right," you say, the only word that fits. She nods, goes back to work. This is the thing about white that you're learning over the course of these weeks, the thing that Madame said on Bond Street and that you keep returning to in the quiet hours of the workroom. White tells the truth. Any fabric of any colour can hide small errors in a certain light. With good dark silk, a seam that's a fraction out of alignment disappears into the depth of the colour. With white, every seam is visible, every stitch is visible. Every decision you've made is there in the fabric, available for inspection. It means that white work has to be better. It means that the skill required for white work is a higher skill than the same skill applied to other colours. Not because white is harder technically, it isn't, but because white has no mercy. White will not flatter imperfection. White demands that the work be worth looking at in the clearest light. You think about this every time you work on any piece of the white commission that you're given, and you are given pieces gradually as the weeks go on and the work expands beyond what Madame and Mrs. Fenwick can do alone. The white muslin underlining of one sleeve of the wedding dress, the white lawn petticoats for 2 other commissions that have come in, 2 weddings, both now requested in white. Both now requiring everything underneath to be white as well, since the white dress would show through a coloured slip. White chemises, white corset covers. The workroom is becoming a white room. The fabric on the tables, the thread in the work baskets, the tissue paper wrapped around finished pieces, all of it in the same family of colour, cream and ivory, and the pure cold white of the best Spitalfields silk. On the morning of the second fitting of the Hartley dress, Miss Hartley arrives at 8. You know this because you hear the bell, and then you hear Madame call for warm water, which means a client is coming in for a fitting, which requires the fitting room, a small room off the showroom that has a cheval mirror and a platform, to be prepared. You don't see the fitting. You're in the workroom working on a white taffeta petticoat for a Mrs. Graves who is marrying in March. But you hear, later, from Mrs. Fenwick, that the fitting went well, that Miss Hartley stood in the partially constructed dress and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time without speaking, that when she finally spoke, she said only, "Yes." That's all, just yes. You picture it. The cold cutting room, the grey February light through the window, and a woman in her half-made white dress looking at herself in a mirror saying yes, to the dress, to what it means, to the self she is choosing to present to the world, and to the man she is marrying, and to the guests who will watch her come down the aisle. Yes to the white. And you think about the 800 women in 800 workrooms across London who are at this same moment making white things for other women who are also going to say yes in front of other mirrors, all of them doing the same thing for the same reason, because a queen chose white and now white is the answer. None of this is ancient. All of this is new. The meaning is still being made right now in these fitting rooms and workrooms and showrooms being attached to the colour the way you attach lace to a collar, carefully, invisibly, stitch by tiny stitch, until the join looks like it was always there. You wonder what white will mean in 20 years, in 50. If the meaning will have settled so deeply by then that no one will remember it wasn't always there. You think it probably will. You think that's how traditions work. Not as facts discovered, but as stories told so often they become facts. Not as things that were always true, but as things that get told as always true, until the telling and the truth become indistinguishable. The dress is finished in the last week of March, ahead of the April wedding. You see it finished only once. Madame brings it on its stand through the workroom to the showroom when Mrs. Fenwick and she are preparing for the final inspection before it's crated, and you see it as it passes through the door for about 5 seconds. 5 seconds is enough. The silk falls in the specific way that Spitalfields silk falls, with that particular weight that is not heavy but is present, that says something about quality without announcing itself. The lace at the cuffs and throat is Mrs. Fenwick's best work. You know Mrs. Fenwick's work intimately by now. You've been studying it for 11 months, and this is the best of it. The finest gauge she's achieved on the pattern she designed specifically for this dress. The seed pearls on the bodice catch the light as the dress moves past the door, briefly, a scatter of brightness against the white. It looks from the outside inevitable, as if it couldn't have been any other way, as if white was always the right answer, and Maison Bouchard always made wedding dresses, and this particular dress was always going to exist. None of that is true. All of it was chosen. All of it was made. By hands you know. Mrs. Fenwick's hands, Madame's hands, your hands in the smaller places. Working in a cold room by candle and window light, decision by decision, stitch by stitch. White because a queen wanted to show the lace. White because white is the colour that tells the truth. White because when Miss Hartley said yes in front of the mirror, she wanted to say it in something that had no lies in it. You watch the dress go through the door, and the door closes, and you pick up your work and go back to stitching. The days after are different, not dramatically. You're still in the workroom, still doing the fine work, the invisible stitches, the gathering and the hemming and the seam finishing. Your hands are stronger now than they were in March, which is something you notice when you hold a bolt of fabric. You can feel the strength differently now, more in your fingertips, more controlled. Your eyes are better at the detail work, not better eyes, not something that would show on an examination, but better at knowing where to look and how to hold the angle and when to stop for the day before the close work starts doing damage. Mrs. Fenwick says, one afternoon in April, without looking up from her bobbins, "You're improving." "Thank you," you say, because there's no other correct response to Mrs. Fenwick giving a compliment. "You'll be doing the good work by autumn," she says, "if you keep on." Good work means the quality of work that goes on the face of a garment, not the underlining, not the structural seams, but the things a client sees, the things a client looks at and says yes or no to. You're not there yet. You're close, but you're not there. And autumn is 8 months away. But Mrs. Fenwick saying it at all means she thinks it's possible. You go back to work, but you think about it. Autumn, the good work, your own hands on the visible surface of things. The workroom has 3 more white wedding commissions in March and April. One of them, a Mrs. Wilson, marrying a barrister, good money but not grand. You do significant portions of. The petticoat, the chemise with the tuck trim, one sleeve of the day dress that will go with the trousseau. You do them well. Not perfectly, not yet, but well enough that Madame looks at the sleeve and says, acceptable, in the tone that, in Madame's vocabulary, means good. The city outside is doing the same thing. All across London, you learn this from Hannah, who learns it from sources you never quite identify, the invisible network of information she seems to be connected to. White fabric is selling out. The silk merchants on Ludgate Hill, the linen drapers on Oxford Street, the muslin sellers, all of them depleted, all of them scrambling to restock, all of them charging more than they did 3 months ago because demand has outrun supply, and everyone knows it, and not just in London. A letter comes from Madame's cousin, who is in the dressmaking business in Birmingham, asking what white fabrics Maison Bouchard is using, because her clients are all asking for white now, and she can't get the quality she needs in Birmingham, and can Madame advise? Madame dictates a reply to you one evening. Your handwriting has improved since you came here, partly because your reading has improved, and partly because Madame has very strong feelings about correspondence. And in it she recommends 2 fabric merchants and advises about the specific weight of silk for the heavy skirt versus the bodice, and adds, at the end, a sentence about lace that is so specifically informed and practical that you think it must be the result of actual experience and not theory. The Queen's dress has become, in 6 weeks, a new standard. Not just a fashion, a standard, the thing that brides aspire to, the thing that defines the occasion. And underneath the standard, 800 women in 800 cold back rooms are doing the invisible work, the stitches that nobody sees, the decisions that nobody credits, making the white things that will be worn in churches across England by women who will stand in front of mirrors and say yes, and whose yes will be partly enabled by the perfection of the seam that you finished at 4 a.m. by candlelight when your eyes were burning and your neck ached and your finger had just stopped bleeding. This is the history that doesn't appear in history books, not the Queen's choice. The Queen's choice is documented, painted, engraved, described in detail in every newspaper in the country, sold in prints that you've seen now in every print shop window you've walked past in the past 6 weeks. The seam, the stitch, the needle, that's what you know. One morning in May, it's a proper May morning, which in London means the air is warmer and the light comes at a different angle through the workroom window, a higher, brighter angle, and the buildings outside look less grey and more white themselves, the stone picking up the warmth of the sky. You're working on the trim for a collar that will go on a dress for a woman who is getting married in June, and the trim is white on white, a white satin ribbon being attached to white lawn with white silk thread. It occurs to you sitting there that you are doing something very specific. You are making the visible record of an invisible choice. The dress will be seen, the ribbon will be seen, the stitching will not be seen, but without the stitching nothing else holds. White tells the truth, Madame said, and what you're making here, stitch by invisible stitch, is the truth underneath the beautiful surface, the structure that makes the beauty possible. You think about the Queen in her white dress on the 10th of February, walking into a chapel at St James's Palace, the 42 lace makers in Devon who made the Honiton lace, the silk weavers in Spitalfields who wove the satin, the dressmakers in the royal household who cut and fitted and pressed and delivered the finished gown, all the invisible hands. You think, we don't know their names. We know the Queen's name. We know the date. We know what the dress looked like, because it was painted and described and engraved and printed and sold in shops all across the country. but we don't know the names of the hands that made it. We never do. This is not a bitter thought, it's just a true one. The difference between a bitter truth and a simple truth is the weight you put on it, and you're deciding not to put weight on it. You're deciding to put the weight on something else, the stitch itself, the fact that the stitch is there, that it's right, that it will hold, long after you've moved on, long after Miss Hartley is married, long after Mrs. Graves is married, long after all of these white dresses have become household garments, and then old clothes, and then rags, and then dust. The stitch was there. You made it. It was right. That's enough. Outside, London is doing its summer warming. The street sounds are different from February. More voice, more open doors, children out of doors, vendors with summer goods, flowers being sold at the corner of the high street by a woman who comes every Wednesday now in the better weather. Inside, the workroom is the same. Mrs. Fenwick bent over her bobbins, Hannah reading a message that has just arrived, then putting it down and going back to her work with that expression that tells you she'll say what it contains when it's time to say it. Agnes, her needle moving, you with the white ribbon on the white lawn, the white thread, the invisible stitch. Your neck hurts. Your eyes are starting to show the slight burn of close work that tells you another hour, and you should stop for a moment. Look up, look at something further away. Give your eyes some distance. But first, the stitch. The light through the window is coming in at the May angle, warmer and higher, and it falls across the white fabric in a way that makes the texture of the weave visible. All those tiny interlocking threads that have been made elsewhere by hands you'll never know, made into fabric that Madame assessed by drape and feel in a merchant's shop on Bond Street. Fabric that will become a collar that will be worn at a wedding. Everything connecting. The chain of hands and decisions and work going back through the silk weavers and the thread spinners and the farmers who grew the cotton and the women who picked it, all the way back and back and back. And here, at this end of the chain, you, one stitch at a time. There are better rooms than this one. There are lighter rooms, cleaner rooms, rooms that don't smell of cold wax at 4 a.m. and don't have ceilings low enough to touch. There are lives easier than this one, lives with more warmth and more sleep and more walking in the open air. But there is not, you've come to understand, better work than this. Not better for what it asks of you. Not better for what it gives back. The attention it requires is the kind of attention that quiets other things. The noise of the city outside, the questions about the future, the homesickness that still arrives sometimes, unpredictably, like weather. When the work is right, when the needle is moving well and the stitch is exactly as it should be, there's nothing else. Just this. Just the fabric and the thread and the decision and then the next decision. 800 decisions per seam. Thousands of seams per garment. Thousands of garments per year. Thousands of hands making them. You work on. And the evening comes the way evenings always come. The light sliding across the wall and eventually retreating. The window going from pale gold to grey to dark. The candles lit again. Supper in the kitchen. The bread and the tea and the standing up because there still aren't enough chairs. And the conversation that is more relaxed in the evening than at other times. Agnes telling a story about something she saw from the window that made her laugh. Edith and Jane finishing each other's sentences the way they do. You go up to the attic. The attic is cold still, even in May, because the attic is always cold. The walls hold the chill longer than the rooms below, and the low roof means the cold comes down on you when you sleep, which is why Agnes sleeps curled tight on her side and you've learned to do the same. You lie down on the bed without undressing because you're very tired and your hands are stiff from the fine work and your neck is doing the thing it does at the end of a long day. The slow bloom of an ache that tells you how long you were bent over. The sounds of London come up through the floorboards. A cart, late, running heavy. Someone singing somewhere. A man's voice carrying across the rooftops with that particular quality that singing has when it travels through city air, the notes flattening slightly, the words unrecognizable but the shape of them still there. You think about the dress, not any specific dress, the idea of the dress. All the white dresses being made right now in all the rooms like this one, all across London, all across the country, all the invisible stitches, all the decisions being made at speeds that leave no room for thinking, just doing. You think about the Queen in her chapel on a February morning, and how a choice she made for practical reasons, the lace, the English industry, the Honiton workers, has become a symbol of something she didn't necessarily intend. How the meaning grew up around the fact the way a vine grows up a wall. How the story attached itself. White means purity now. White means the beginning of something. White means I am presenting myself today as the version of myself that this occasion calls for. None of that was true before Victoria's dress. All of it will be true, unquestionably, permanently, for generations. The story becomes the fact becomes the tradition becomes the thing that was always true. In the rooms where the dresses are made, the women know better. They know the thread colours and the fabric weights and how long it takes to make a Honiton cuff. And they know that none of it is magic and all of it is work. They know that the white dress is as human as everything else that human hands make. Imperfect and decided and dear and hard, but they make it beautifully anyway. Because beautiful is what's asked for, and they know how to give it. And because there is, in the making itself, in the right stitch, the right drape, the right join between lace and fabric, something that has its own kind of truth. The truth of a thing done as well as it can be done. The truth of hands that know what they're doing. The truth of work that outlasts the worker. Your own hands are still. The stiffness in them is beginning to ease, the way it does when you're lying down and the day is over. Your eyes are closed. The city goes on outside. The print shops are selling their prints of the royal wedding, and they will keep selling them for years. And every woman who looks at them will see the white dress and will know, in her body as much as her mind, that white is what weddings mean. That white has always been what weddings mean. That no other choice would make sense. And somewhere in the memory of a 17-year-old girl in an attic in Mayfair, the truth will be different. The truth will be, a queen wanted to show the lace. The truth will be February 10th, and a choice made for practical reasons that became a symbol. The truth will be hands in cold rooms, candles, invisible stitches, the smell of hot wax and fresh thread. The truth will be, I was there. I helped make this. Not the Queen's dress. Never the Queen's dress. You were in a different room entirely, sewing a different white thing for a different woman. But all the white things that came after, all the dresses that followed in the wake of Victoria's choice, in the long wave of it that rolled out across every room where needles go through fabric. I was one of the hands. That's not nothing. That might be everything. You're warm enough. You're full enough. The bread and the tea doing their good plain work. You're tired in the way that is complete, the way that comes after a day of real work done as well as you can do it. The sounds of the city grow softer, or maybe you're just listening less. The man's voice singing somewhere across the rooftops has stopped, or moved on, or faded below the threshold of your hearing. What's left is the particular quality of London night, which is never fully silent, but has its own version of quiet, its own lower register. The city breathing rather than shouting. The months you've been here settle around you like the blanket you forgot to pull up. 11 months, 12 now, or close. The girl who stepped off the wagon from Hull with her 2 dresses and her letter of introduction and her hands that shook when Madame asked her to thread a needle. She's still you, she's still there, but she's further back than she was. You know things she didn't know. You know that the distance between a 9/16 stitch and a perfect stitch is not a distance that can be crossed all at once. You know that cold mornings at 4 are not extraordinary, they are the ordinary. You know the smell of good Spitalfields silk and how it falls, and the difference between the tension in a seam that will hold and a seam that will go. You know Mrs. Fenwick's voice when she's satisfied and when she's not. And you know that Madame's nod at the end of a commission has a weight in it that you didn't understand when you first arrived, and understand now in your hands, in the specific way your hands feel when the work has been good. You know London, not all of it. Not the parts that aren't yours, the court, the grand houses and the criminal back streets and the docks and the theatrical world and 100 other Londons stacked on top of each other like the layers of a dress. But your London, Clifton Street and Longacre and Bond Street, and the route to Mr. Partridge's shop with the window full of coloured thread, and the sound of the church bells from St. George's marking the quarter hours, and the smell of London in February and London in May, and the specific quality of light that London has on a clear morning when the sun comes at a low angle, and everything turns slightly golden. You're becoming someone who belongs here. The thought is quiet and complete, like a seam that's finished. You don't think about it too long. Thinking about it too long would be like staring directly at what you're trying to see, which Mrs. Fenwick told you not to do. You see better at night from the corner of your eye. You see the changing of yourself better from the side in passing, not by looking straight at it. Tomorrow there will be work, the collar for the June wedding, the underlining for Mrs. Graves's travelling dress, the new commission that arrived yesterday. A Mrs. Fletcher who's getting married in July and who has asked, through a letter that Hannah read aloud to the workroom with an expression of absolute neutrality, for a dress of white silk with a long train and Honiton lace and seed pearls, which means she has read about the Queen's dress somewhere and wants exactly that, which means Madame will spend the next 20 minutes with Mrs. Fenwick discussing how to give Mrs. Fletcher the spirit of what she wants without producing a copy of a royal wedding dress, which is not the same thing. Tomorrow, all of that. Right now, just this. The cold in the attic is settling into its nighttime level, which is actually bearable, which Agnes has explained is because the heat from the rooms below rises and meets the cold from the roof, and they reach a compromise somewhere around the level of your nose. You pull the blanket up. Agnes is breathing in her slow, sleeping way, small and steady. The city breathes too. Something in you breathes with it. The last candle on the stair landing, the one Madame keeps burning until Mrs. Fenwick comes up, which won't be for another hour, makes a thread of light under the attic door. It shifts very slightly. A draught somewhere below, moving through the building, the kind of movement that old buildings have, the structure settling and breathing in its own slow way. The white dress. In 4 years there will be another woman who asks for a white dress and calls it traditional, and in 15 years it will be the only thing any woman asks for, and in 30 years the meaning, purity, innocence, the new beginning, will be as firmly attached to the white colour as if it grew there naturally, as if it had been there always. It will have been there since February 1840. It will have been made in rooms like this one, by hands like yours. The thread and the needle and the candle stub and the needle going in at 4 in the morning, the slip, the blood on your finger, the silk still perfect and unruined. All of this will be invisible in the dress, the way all stitching is invisible when the dress is done, the way the work disappears into the beautiful surface that the work made possible. Let it disappear. It was there. You were there. That's all it needs to be. Sleep is coming the way it comes when the body has decided, not gradually but all at once, the way a tide turns, the way light goes at the end of a candle that's been burning low for a long time. Not darkness, but something warmer than darkness, something that has colour in it if you're going to look for colour, the colour of a warm room, the colour of good cloth, the colour that contains all colours and gives them all back, white. The sounds of London slow beneath you, or you slow beneath them, one of those. The breathing of the city, the breathing of Agnes, your own breathing which you stop noticing the moment you start noticing it. The stitch, the needle, the decision, and then the next decision, and then the next, and then the long rest between one day's work and the next, the dark quiet hours where your hands can be still and your eyes can close and your neck can unknot itself and all the decisions can pause. This is where you live. In the room, in the work, in the long unfolding of a skill being learned, in the city that contains you and that you are slowly learning to contain. Centuries will pass. The workroom on Clifton Street will be gone, pulled down for something else, and Clifton Street itself will change beyond recognition, and London will change so completely that if you walked its streets in 100 years, you would know nothing except the river, and even the river will be different, tamed and bridged and lit at night so the link boys will have no work. But people will still get married, still choose their dresses, still stand in front of mirrors in fitting rooms and say yes to what they see, and the white dress will be there, made by hands that won't be named, made in rooms that won't be remembered, made stitch by invisible stitch by women who knew the truth, that white is not ancient, that it was chosen for practical reasons on a February morning in 1840, that the meaning came after the choice and not before. But who made the beautiful thing anyway? Because the beautiful thing was asked for, and they knew how to give it. Your hands are still now. The thread is put away. The needle is in its case. The candle has gone out on its own, finally, the flame sinking into the last of the wax and going, and you rest. You've earned this. Take it. Good night. There is something you don't fully understand about the lace industry until Mrs. Fenwick explains it to you on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of the Hartley dress. When the two of you are alone in the workroom for an hour because Madame has taken the other girls to help shift the fabric stocks from the storeroom to the cutting room. Mrs. Fenwick is making lace. This is the part of her work you find most impossible to comprehend, which is why you watch it whenever you have the opportunity. She makes bobbin lace, which involves a pillow stuffed with horsehair and wool, dozens of small wooden bobbins wound with thread, and a pattern of pins stuck into the pillow along the design. The bobbins hang from the pillow, swinging when she moves them, their weight providing the tension that the thread needs to lie correctly. She works with her hands at a speed that seems, every time you watch it, unlikely for the result it produces. The bobbins click against each other. The thread crosses and recrosses. The pattern grows, pin by pin, line by line. How long does this take, you ask? She looks at the piece she's working on, which is a cuff edging for the Hartley dress, a pattern of intertwined vine leaves, about 3 inches wide, perhaps 6 inches long at the current stage. This? 2 days more. For 6 inches, for 6 inches. She doesn't say it as if it's remarkable. It's just the fact. You do the mathematics in your head. The full lace trim for the Hartley dress, the cuffs, the throat, the hem edging, is roughly 12 yards. 12 yards of lace at roughly 3 inches wide. That's 12 yards times 36 inches, divided by 6 inches per 2 days. That's 216 days worth of lace. There are 42 people making the Queen's lace, you say. Mrs. Fenwick nods. In Devon, you say. In a village. In several villages, she says. They've been at it since last autumn. The whole of the Honiton district was involved. 120,000 stitches in the lace alone, someone said. I believe it. 120,000 stitches. You try to picture it. You make roughly 400 stitches per hour on fine work when you're working well. 120,000 stitches would take you 300 hours. That's nearly 40 working days without stopping. For one woman. 42 women working since autumn. For one dress. Why did she choose Honiton, you ask? Mrs. Fenwick looks at you. It's the look she gives when you ask a question that has a real answer. Because Honiton was dying, she says. The machine lace from Nottingham, from Brussels. It's cheaper. It's consistent. Most people can't tell the difference if you're not looking closely. She pauses. The hand lace makers in Devon couldn't compete on price. They could only compete on quality. And quality doesn't matter if nobody will pay for it. She pauses again. The Queen decided it mattered. When royalty decides something matters, people believe it. So she saved the industry. Mrs. Fenwick considers this. She bought it time. Whether it's saved, that depends on whether women of quality keep choosing hand lace over machine, which is a choice that has to be made over and over. You can't save something once. You can only keep choosing to save it. She goes back to her bobbins. The clicking resumes. The thread crosses and recrosses. You think about 42 women in Devon villages, bent over their pillows in the same posture as Mrs. Fenwick, in the same quality of silence, making something that would be seen once and worn once and then kept in tissue paper for decades, brought out at anniversaries, held up to the light, admired. You wonder if they knew, those lace makers, what the dress would become. If anyone explained to them that this particular piece of work, this particular cross and twist of thread under the Devon light, was going to change what every bride in England would wear for the next 150 years. Probably not. Probably they just made the lace. Because it was good work, and good work was what they had. The same way you make the stitches. The same way Mrs. Fenwick makes the bobbins click. You pick up your needle and go back to work. The matter of white fabric and the shortage of it becomes, over the course of February and March, one of the defining economic facts of the London dressmaking world. It begins simply enough. Madam sends to 2 merchants for white Spitalfields silk. One merchant writes back immediately that he has it. The other writes back 3 days later that he has very little remaining and expects a new delivery in 10 days. Madame orders from both, but by the time the second merchant's delivery arrives, he has a different tone. The price is higher. He is very sorry. The suppliers are very sorry. The demand has been, he pauses in his letter, unprecedented. Unprecedented. In 10 days, the entire supply chain for white silk in London has adjusted itself around the new reality. The weavers in Spitalfields, whose looms can make white silk on the same equipment as any other colour. White silk is not technically harder to weave, it's just harder to maintain once woven. Are running every loom at capacity for white, but they can only run so fast. And the demand, which was negligible in January, is now enormous in February, and there is a gap between where the supply is and where the demand has suddenly moved to, and that gap is being filled by price increases and anxious letters and madames standing in the cutting room with a particular expression that you've never seen before on her face, and that you now recognise as constrained urgency. There is a hierarchy to the white fabric crisis, and you understand it by watching who gets priority. At the top, the court dressmakers, the grand establishments that serve the highest ranked clients. They have existing relationships with the best merchants, and those relationships mean that when supply is short, the merchant calls them first. Below that, establishments like Maison Bouchard, respectable and reliable, but not the top of the hierarchy. Madame's relationship with Mr. Aldous is good. Excellent, in fact, better than most in her position. And this means she's not at the bottom of the list. She gets white silk. But she gets it more slowly than she'd like, and she gets it at prices that are higher than they should be. And there are 2 commissions in March where she has to substitute a slightly different white. Off-white, ivory, the kind of white that is only white when held against something darker. And explain to the client that this particular ivory will look better in the chapel light than the stark white would have done anyway, which is true, actually, but is not the whole truth. At the bottom, the smaller dressmakers, the ones who serve the less wealthy clients, the women who are getting married on smaller budgets, and who also want white because the Queen wore white, and fashion does not stop at any income level. It just changes what's possible within that level. These women are wearing white cotton and white muslin and white calico if they can get silk at all. And the cotton and muslin and calico are themselves running short, because demand there has also increased. The whole city is scrambling for white fabric, and in some strange way that you're only beginning to understand, this scramble, all this urgency and shortage and price adjustment, is the translation of a symbol into an economy. The Queen's dress was a symbol. What it means practically in the city that exists below the level of symbols is this. The thread sellers on Long Acre are staying open later. The linen drapers on Oxford Street are reordering twice a week. The women who work in the Spitalfields weaving houses are working longer hours. The lacemakers in Devon are taking on more commissions than they can comfortably manage. The girl in the Mayfair workroom is making more white stitches per day than she was making a month ago. A symbol, turned into the movement of goods and hands and hours. This is how fashion works. This is how fashion has always worked. Not just beauty, not just aesthetics, not just the desire to be seen in the right colour at the right moment. Behind every dress is an economy. Behind every choice is a chain of production that stretches from the cotton field to the spinning mill, to the loom, to the merchant, to the cutter, to the seamstress, to the hand that attaches the final hook and eye. Every choice a woman makes about what to wear is a vote cast, without awareness, usually without intention, in favour of one part of that chain over another. The Queen voted for Spitalfields silk. She voted for Honiton lace. She voted without announcing it as a vote for the workers who make those things over the workers who make the cheaper alternatives. You are one of the workers. You know this differently now than you knew it when you arrived. You knew it then as a fact. You know it now as something felt in your hands and your back, and the particular texture of the silk between your fingers when you're doing the good work. What happens in the workroom today matters in ways that are larger than the workroom. You're not sure if that makes it heavier or lighter. Probably both. In the middle of March, Hannah comes back from an errand on Oxford Street with a look on her face that you've learned means she's seen something worth reporting, but hasn't yet decided how. She reports it after supper in the kitchen with an unusual completeness that tells you it impressed her. Every dressmaker's shop on the street, she says. Every one. White in the window, white dress, white ribbon, white sample fabric. She pauses. In November there were perhaps 2 windows with white. Now there are 40. How many had white before? Agnes asks. 2 that I saw. The court dressmaker on the corner had white in the window, because they always have everything, and a smaller shop that had a christening robe displayed. She pauses again. Now 40, and the prices in the windows of the fabric shops. She names a figure. That's 30% more than it was. 30%, Cecily says. In 6 weeks, Hannah says. Madame, coming through the kitchen for something, hears this last part. She doesn't comment on it, but you see in her face the confirmation of something she already knew, and you understand that the conversation she had with Mrs. Fenwick about white not being a fashion but being a queen was not just an observation, it was a forecast. She has spent 30 years watching fashion move, and she knew, the moment the news of Victoria's dress reached her, exactly what was coming. She's been preparing for it for 3 weeks. The preparation is visible if you know where to look. The extra white thread Madame ordered in the 2nd week of February, more than twice what she'd usually have on hand. The appointment with Mr. Aldous that she made 3 days after hearing about the royal dress, before anyone else had thought to make appointments, which is why she got the good silk and not the second quality alternative. The conversation with the lace supplier that happened at the same time, which secured 3 additional pieces of bobbin lace from a maker in Herefordshire, who produces in the Honiton style and whose quality is good enough for the commissions Maison Bouchard handles. All of this before the first new white wedding inquiry arrived. Mrs. Fenwick calls it foresight. You call it, in your private thoughts, the thing that separates someone who is very good at something from someone who is merely good at it. Madame is not just a dressmaker. She is someone who understands what dressmaking is embedded in. The city, the season, the social world, the way information moves through that world, and how quickly it moves and which direction it tends to go. She understood before anyone told her that white was going to change everything. You want to understand things before anyone tells you. You're not sure yet if that's something you can learn, or something you either have or you don't. You're beginning to suspect it can be learned, but slowly, and mostly by paying attention to people who already have it and watching how they read the world. This is what you're doing, watching, filing, learning the shape of what things mean before the meaning is announced. One afternoon near the end of February, Madame gives you an errand that takes you to Regent Street. Regent Street in 1840 is not quite what it will become. It's still relatively new. The grand curved colonnade designed by John Nash only completed in the previous decade. The shops still establishing themselves in what was intended as the grandest shopping street in the world. But it is already extraordinary. You've been past the entrance twice since you arrived in London, both times with specific purposes in other directions, both times only catching a glimpse of the longer curve of colonnade stretching away to the north and the particular quality of the light in the street. wide and open in a way that most London streets aren't. The buildings kept to a consistent height, so the sky's actually visible in a long pale rectangle above the road. Today you're going in, you're carrying a message for a milliner's establishment 3/4 of the way up the street. A message from Madame about some ribbon that is wanted for the March commissions. The walk through Regent Street takes longer than it should because you slow down. You're aware of slowing down. You're aware that this is technically an inefficiency and that Madame values efficiency. You slow down anyway. The shops here are a different order of establishment from the ones on Clifton Street or Longacre. Wider windows, better lighting, more deliberate display. You can see, in each window you pass, the careful arrangement of goods. The thought that has gone into which object is at which height, which colour is placed next to which colour to make both of them look better. This is the visual language of selling. The same thing Madame does in her showroom window, but on a grander scale, with more money behind it. You pass a draper's. The window is full of white fabric, not just a bolt or two. An entire display, specifically assembled, with different textures and weights arranged at different heights to show the variety. White silk at the centre, the high-quality piece catching the light. White cotton to the left, more accessible. The bolt open and the edge draped down to show the texture. White muslin to the right, fine and slightly sheer, suggesting undergarments and sleeve linings. And in front of all of them, a small hand-lettered card. Fine white silks, satins, cottons and muslins. Bridal quality. Bridal quality. It's a new phrase. You haven't heard it before last week. Now it's in every fabric merchant's window you've passed in the past 3 days. Bridal quality, meaning specifically intended for a wedding dress, specifically chosen with the Queen's wedding in mind, specifically marketed to women who want to wear what a queen wore. The phrase will be around for a long time, probably forever in one form or another. You stand at the window for a moment, looking at the white fabric in the London February light. You're not buying anything. You're not here to buy anything. You have a message to deliver and a limited amount of time in which to deliver it. But you're looking. You're looking at the economy of a symbol, at the way one dress, worn one morning in one chapel, has already reorganised the contents of a draper's window on Regent Street, is already filling the order books of silk merchants and lace suppliers and haberdashers from here to Birmingham. We'll keep reorganising things, not just this season, for decades. You think about what Madame said to Mrs. Fenwick in the cutting room. This isn't a fashion, this is a queen. You walk on, deliver the message, walk back. Mrs. Fenwick leaves, one evening in April, at an unusual time. It's not unheard of for Mrs. Fenwick to leave the building in the evening. She goes home sometimes on Fridays when the work allows, to her own lodgings in Bloomsbury, a room she's kept for 15 years in the same house, and which she describes, when she describes it at all, with the particular affection of someone for whom a private space is genuinely precious. But tonight she leaves on a Wednesday, which is unusual, and she leaves quickly, putting on her coat with a purposefulness that is different from her normal economy of movement. Madame accompanies her to the door and says something in a low voice that you don't catch. Mrs. Fenwick comes back the next morning looking the same as always, except that when you look carefully, when you look the way you've learned to look from the corner of your eye, there's something slightly different. A quality of having been somewhere that mattered and returned with the weight of it still present. You find out later from Hannah, who finds out from Mrs. Fenwick herself in the cutting room on Friday afternoon when you're not there but Hannah is, that Mrs. Fenwick's daughter got engaged on Wednesday evening, that the engagement is to a good man, a chandler's assistant in Bloomsbury, steady and kind and with prospects, that Mrs. Fenwick walked to Bloomsbury to congratulate her daughter and meet the young man, and was given a cup of tea and spent 2 hours sitting at her daughter's table being shown the ring, which is a small garnet, and talking about the wedding, which will be small and modest and in a church that doesn't have a famous choir or a famous architecture, and the dress, which will be whatever Mrs. Fenwick's daughter and her future husband can afford, which is not very much, which will not be white, not because of any objection to white. Mrs. Fenwick's daughter, Hannah reports, apparently said quite plainly that she thought white was beautiful, and that she'd seen the fashion plates and understood the new fashion. But because white requires white fabric, and white fabric requires either money or the right skills, and they have neither in sufficient quantity, Mrs. Fenwick is going to make her daughter's dress herself in her evenings. It will be pale grey silk. Grey because grey was what the merchant had at a good price. Grey because grey is elegant and practical, and will serve for years of Sunday best after the wedding is over. Grey, not white, because grey is what's possible. You think about this for several days after Hannah tells you. You think about the gap between the tradition being made at the level of queens and court dressmakers and grand establishments on Regent Street, and the level at which Mrs. Fenwick's daughter is getting married in a small Bloomsbury church in grey silk on a Saturday afternoon. Fashion descends. That's the word people use. Fashion descends from the heights to the middle ranks to the lower ranks, like water finding its level. The Queen wore white, and eventually every bride in England will wear white. But eventually is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Eventually means first the women who can afford the white silk and the white lace, and the white seed pearls. Then, a few years later, the women who can afford a simpler white. Then, a decade later, the women who can afford white cotton at least, white muslin at least, something white even if it's modest. And at some point, not yet, not in 1840, not in this February, even the women who can't afford any of those things will find a way to wear something white, because by then white will have settled so deeply into the idea of what a wedding is that not being able to afford it will feel like a different kind of deprivation than just not being able to afford silk. Mrs. Fenwick's daughter is wearing grey in April 1840. Her granddaughter probably will wear white, and her granddaughter will not know that she's participating in something that didn't exist until Queen Victoria decided she wanted to show the Honiton lace. The granddaughter will think she's participating in history. She'll be right. She just won't know which part of it. Mrs. Fenwick finishes the grey dress in 3 evenings. She brings it in once, laid over her arm, to show it to Madame because Madame asked to see it. Madame looks at it for a moment with the expression she uses for finished work, comprehensive and specific, and says, "Good construction." Mrs. Fenwick nods. "The sleeve is excellent," Madame says. "Better than the last 3 sleeves she's done for us." "Evening work," Mrs. Fenwick says. "More time to think." Madame looks at her. A small expression you don't often see. "She's lucky," Madame says. "Your daughter." A pause. Madame goes back to the cutting room. Mrs. Fenwick folds the dress back over her arm and takes it home that evening. The wedding is on a Saturday. Mrs. Fenwick comes back on Monday looking the same as always, except that there's a small pressed flower, a white flower, a snowdrop, pinned inside her collar, barely visible, just there. Nobody mentions it. You all see it. She works until 7 that evening without stopping. The print shops along Vere Street and on the side streets off Regent Street are in February and March and April running a particular kind of business that you understand better with each passing week. When you first walked past them, in the early weeks after the royal wedding, the windows were full of what you'd expect. The portrait of the Queen in her wedding dress, copied from the official portrait by George Hayter, that had been distributed through every respectable publication in the country. The Queen standing with Prince Albert, both in white, surrounded by bridesmaids, the chapel at St. James's, standard commemorative prints, the kind of thing that families buy and frame and put above the mantelpiece, and that in 40 years will be the evidence for anyone who looks that this wedding happened and that it looked like this. But alongside those portraits, something else begins appearing in the windows, something more directly commercial, more directly aimed at the women who are responding to the wedding by changing their own plans. Fashion plates. Not the usual fashion plates, the ones that show the season's silhouettes, which appear in every magazine and are copied from Paris, and depict theoretical women in theoretical dresses that may or may not bear any relationship to what actual dressmakers can make for actual money. These are specifically bridal fashion plates. Women in white wedding gowns, drawn in the style of the royal wedding portrait, but obviously not claiming to be royal. Just a bride in white, with lace, with orange blossom in her hair, because the Queen had orange blossom and the orange blossom, the flowers of the orange tree associated with purity and fertility, is being rapidly attached to the idea of the white wedding, becoming part of it, inseparable from it. Orange blossom, that's another thing that is not ancient. That's another thing that is, in early 1840, being invented as a tradition by being done once very publicly and immediately copied everywhere. But you don't know that yet. You know the orange blossom is appearing in the fashion plates, and you know Mrs. Fenwick has sourced artificial orange blossom, silk flowers, very fine, almost impossible to distinguish from real ones, for the Hartley dress headpiece, because real orange blossom in February in England is not available. And the artificial kind is an industry in itself. Workshops in France making them. Workshops in London making them. The demand for them spiking in February the same way the demand for white silk spiked. Everything at once. The whole visual language of the English wedding being invented in the first weeks of February 1840 in the wake of one woman's choice. You buy a fashion plate once. You spend 4p of your own money on it, which is more than you should spend, which is more than you've spent on anything for yourself in months. You buy it because you've been walking past a print shop window for 3 weeks, seeing it, and one afternoon when you're passing on an errand with a few minutes to spare and the shop is not busy, you go in and spend the 4p. It's a hand-coloured plate showing a bride in a white gown with a long lace veil, orange blossom at the temple, flowers in the foreground suggesting spring. The white is rendered in engraving as the absence of colour, just the paper, with the shadows shown in grey wash and the highlights left untouched. It's elegant. It's aspirational in the way fashion plates are always aspirational, suggesting a woman who exists just slightly above reality. You take it back to the attic and prop it against the wall where you can see it from your bed. Agnes looks at it for a moment. "Is that her?" she asks. "The Queen?" "No, just a bride." Agnes looks at it another moment. "Pretty," she says, and goes back to sleep. You look at it in the candlelight for a while before you blow out the candle. A bride in white. The tradition that is being made right now in this city by the hands in this workroom and in the 800 workrooms like it, by the choices of women with money to spend and women without money who are spending it anyway, by the fashion plates and the newspaper descriptions and the copies of the image of a 20-year-old queen in Spitalfields silk wanting to show the Honiton lace. You fall asleep looking at the white dress in the engraving, and you dream, though you won't remember it in the morning, of stitches. Long white stitches stretching from one edge of the dark to the other, fine and even and invisible, the way good work is invisible, the way the best work is always invisible, the structure underneath, the truth underneath, the hands that made it. There and not there. There. There is a moment, sometime in the second week of April. The Hartley dress is 2 weeks from delivery. The workroom is at its most intensely concentrated, and you've been working on the final petticoat for a bridesmaid's dress that was added to the Hartley commission at the last minute, when you put down your needle and look at your hands. Just look at them. The left index finger where the needle went in at 4 a.m. in February still has a small scar, barely visible, a point of slightly paler skin on the pad. The skin around your fingertips has changed since you came here, drier, rougher in the places where the thread runs, slightly thickened at the points of most contact with needle and fabric. Your nails are kept short because long nails catch on fine fabric. Your knuckles are larger than they were in Hull, slightly swollen in the way that cold and repeated close work makes them, which Mrs. Fenwick says will ease in summer, and which Agnes says never fully eases, and you're choosing to believe Mrs. Fenwick on this particular point. These are working hands. They look different from the hands you had when you stepped off the wagon from Hull. You wonder if the lace makers in Devon have hands like this. You think they probably do. You think every woman who does this kind of work has hands that are the same, marked by the work, changed by the work, shaped by it over years and decades until the work and the hand are hard to separate. Mrs. Fenwick's hands. You've looked at them carefully since you came here, in the way you look at things you want to understand, from the corner of your eye rather than directly. They are the hands of a woman who has been making lace for 32 years, and they show it the way a tool shows its use. Smooth where they've been handled, shaped around the grip of the bobbins, the fingertips almost as precise as the lace itself, as if they've absorbed something from 30 years of fine work. You want hands like that. Not in the sense of wanting to look old or wanting to show suffering, in the sense of wanting your hands to hold the history of what they've done, to be readable, to tell anyone who looked carefully enough the story of what you've made, maybe in 30 years, maybe in less, if you keep on. The petticoat's hem is nearly done. You pick up the needle. The afternoon of the day the Hartley dress is finally collected is one of the quietest afternoons in the workroom since you arrived. Not because there's nothing to do. There is always something to do. There are always 3 commissions in various states, always thread to wind and fabric to press and lace to attach. But because something has finished. Something large and consuming and precise has arrived at its end, and the end of a thing that large has a particular quality of silence to it, a silence that isn't nothing but is the sound of after. Mrs. Fenwick is the one who wraps it. She wraps the dress in white tissue, many layers, the tissue crackling softly as she smooths each one, the sound very precise in the quiet room, and then in linen, and then in more tissue. She works without rush. Her hands on the white silk are completely steady. The man comes with a trunk lined in silk. He's very careful. He signs a receipt. He thanks Madame in the precise formal way of someone who does this for a living and understands that the people receiving him are professionals and should be addressed as such. He takes the trunk. The showroom is quiet after he leaves. Madame stands in the showroom for a moment. You can see her through the door, which has been left ajar. She's not looking at anything in particular. She's just standing in the way that someone stands when they've done something difficult and are taking a moment before they begin the next difficult thing. Then she goes to the cutting room. Mrs. Fenwick goes back to her lace. You pick up the next piece of work. And that's it. That's how it ends. Not with celebration, not with a reckoning, not with Miss Hartley coming back to thank anyone. Clients don't come back to thank dressmakers. The dress is delivered. The work is done. The next commission begins. But you've seen something that you haven't yet found words for. Something about the way work continues after any particular piece of it is finished. About how the skills you develop on one commission carry into the next. How the stitches you made on the Hartley petticoats made you better at the stitches you're making now. How in 10 years, in 20, in 30, the invisible accumulation of all of these invisible stitches will be the entire substance of what you know. You're making yourself, stitch by stitch, the same way you're making the dresses, decision by decision, in the cold, in the light that's better than it was at 4 o'clock, in the company of women who are all doing the same thing and who are making themselves the same way, each in their own form, each at their own pace. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, everything. The month of May arrives, and with it, a gradual loosening of the intense pace that February started and March and April sustained. There are still white commissions, 3 at any given moment in various stages, but the acute crisis of supply and demand has begun to resolve. The Spitalfields weavers have caught up with the demand. Mr. Aldous has restocked twice and is no longer writing apologetic letters about price increases. The lace situation is stable, or stable enough, which is to say that the wait time for good bobbin lace has come down from the weeks it reached in March to something more manageable, and the city is full of white dresses, or filling with them. Walking to Mr. Partridge's on an errand in early May, you count 3 white wedding gowns in the windows of dressmakers' establishments on the route. 2 fashion plates in print shop windows specifically showing white bridal looks. 1 real bride. You see her from a distance coming out of a church on Hanover Square with her wedding party around her. Too far away to see her face, but close enough to see the white of her dress catching the spring light. White. Already everywhere. Already beginning to look inevitable. You think, I know when this started. I was there when this started. Not there in the chapel, not there anywhere grand or visible. There in a cold workroom at 4 in the morning, making a tiny invisible stitch in a chemise that would never be seen, for a woman who would wear it once and then fold it in tissue and put it away. There in the most invisible possible way. But there. You continue down the street, your shawl no longer needed because May has arrived with actual warmth, the air finally losing the cold that London carries through February and March and half of April. The city sounds different in warmth, more open. The doors of shops stay open rather than closed, and the sounds of the city flow more freely between buildings. You pass a flower seller on the corner. She has forced orange blossom, real orange blossom, which in May is possible, which in February wasn't, laid out on a board with white ribbon woven through the stems. She's selling them, you see from the card, specifically for bridal use, for hair wreaths, for bouquets. Orange blossom everywhere now, white everything everywhere now. You buy a single stem, a halfpenny. You're not sure why exactly. You tuck it into your buttonhole and walk on to Mr. Partridge's and do the errand and walk back, and the orange blossom is still in your buttonhole when you get back to the workroom, white and small and very faintly sweet against the darker fabric of your dress. Mrs. Fenwick looks at it when you come in. Orange blossom, she says. From the corner, you say. She looks at it for another moment. Royal fashion, she says. It'll be everywhere now. Not with disapproval, just as a fact. The same way she states all facts. Yes, you say. You take off your shawl, put it away, sit down at your bench and pick up the needle. The orange blossom stays in your buttonhole until the end of the day, when it's slightly wilted but still holding its shape, still white, still faintly sweet when you lift it close enough. You put it in the gap between the windowsill and the wall, where Agnes keeps a sprig of dried lavender that she brought from somewhere months ago. The next morning it's dry, small and white and there. You leave it. It stays there through May and into June, going from white to the faintest cream, the petals papering thin, the stem going from green to grey. Nobody moves it. It just stays, small and white and finished, on the windowsill of the cold workroom where the needles go through white fabric and the stitches are invisible and the work is always, always beginning. But that's the thing about the white dress, about any tradition at the moment of its making. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a sign saying, "This is the beginning." It doesn't feel different from any other morning when you're doing the work. The morning of February 10th felt the same as any February morning, cold, grey, the candles burning down, the needle in the white fabric, your neck aching and the city outside already in its usual noise. The shockwave came later. The shockwave is still coming. In houses across England, women are right now setting aside the lavender and the blue and the whatever colour you had, and writing to their dressmakers about white. Those letters are arriving at establishments like Maison Bouchard in their dozens. Those letters are being answered with measurements requested and fabric samples sent. Those letters are the leading edge of a wave that will take 50 years to fully arrive, and will never after that fully recede. And somewhere at the beginning of that wave, barely visible, almost invisible, a needle going in, a drop of blood contained, white silk unruined, a stitch made that no one will ever see, in a chemise that will go in tissue and come out for anniversaries and eventually stop being brought out at all. The stitch made anyway, made well, made in the cold by someone who was learning, who was still in the process of becoming the person whose hands would eventually know how to make it without thinking, made in the knowledge that white tells the truth, that good work is visible in ways that transcend visibility, that the dress, when it finally goes, when Miss Hartley finally wears it and says her yes in front of whoever is assembled to witness it, the dress will carry all of these invisible decisions, all these cold mornings, all these hours. It won't look like history, the dress. It will look like a dress, beautiful, white, fitted to the body that will wear it. The lace at the cuffs will catch the light in the way that Honiton-style lace catches light, making something out of air and thread that looks like more than the sum of its parts. The seed pearls will scatter a brightness across the bodice. The silk will fall the way Spitalfields silk falls, with that weight that is presence and not heaviness. It will look inevitable. It will look like it couldn't have been otherwise. That's the art of it. Not just the dressmaking art, though. That's real and specific and learned at the cost of cold mornings and burning eyes and needles going in at 4 when the hands aren't warmed. The larger art. The art of making something look as if it was always going to be exactly this. As if the choice was obvious. As if the tradition was ancient. As if the white dress has always been the thing you wear when you stand before witnesses and choose your future. The art of making the new thing look like it's been there forever. You are part of that art. Small, invisible, 17, one of 8 women in a cold workroom, one of 800 women in 800 workrooms, one of 8,000 women across England who are right now making the white thing that the tradition requires. You are making the tradition. Not alone, never alone, always alongside, but you are making it. The needle is in your hand, the stitch is clean, the white silk is still perfect. This is where you are. This is what you're doing. This is the story you're living inside invisibly, not knowing that it is a story anyone will ever tell, not knowing that 100 years from now someone will explain the white wedding dress as an ancient custom, not knowing that the choice you made to hold your bleeding finger away from the silk at 4 in the morning in February is the same choice being made in rooms all over England in the same hour, the same caution, the same care, the same desire to make the thing beautiful and right and worth the cold and the hours and the burning eyes. You know what you know, the stitch, the silk, the needle, the mourning. You know this is enough. It is. Good night.